Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about What If Deku Had Wings of Fire Part 2. If you guys enjoy this What If and want to see Part 3, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗃_444 from AO3. So let's start the video. And that was how Izuku found himself standing shakily on narrow, windy window ledge some 150 meters up in the air not even 24 hours later. Well, partly. He couldn't really blame Katsuki entirely. Entering from the top had been all his idea. Izuku flattened himself against the wall, breathing shallowly. The window beside him was the only one in the entire, barricaded castle, complete with spires and walls and beckoning turret tops. Squatting like a thorny bullfrog on one of the offshoot islands of Meathead territory, the little Isle of Forget-Me. If Izuku looked down, something he was trying very, very hard not to, he could just see the tiny figures of hundreds and hundreds of Meathead guards and their driller dragons patrolling the courtyard below. "Please, Thor," he prayed, "please, just let me do this one thing without problems." Thor, apparently, had a really, really bad sense of humor. Just as Izuku was lifting a foot to nudge himself through the window and into the library, a brisk gust of wind whipped through the tower turrets and set him ever so slightly off balance. Honestly, Izuku should have expected it. His whole life this past year had been one big ha-ha from the heavens. Izuku's foot slipped on the crumbly edge of the window. With a smothered shriek of unbridled terror, he fell off the wall entirely. Stomach swooping, arms and legs scrabbling wildly, he just managed to catch the edge of the ledge as he fell with one flailing hand, leaving him hanging by a limb with nothing between him and the hard ground below but 150 meters of pure, clean air. Izuku screamed again. Slowly, hundreds of pairs of eyes of Meathead guards and their dragons lifted upwards and locked on him. "How did I get myself into this mess?" Izuku thought hysterically, as Katsuki yelled and scrabbled at the back of his hand from inside the library. "How on this good green earth did I ever think this was a good idea?" "Well, let's leave Izuku hanging there for the moment and go back and see, shall we?" Roughly an hour after Izuku had broken out of hooligan prison with the help of a wizened not-grandma, his technically mentor and a dragon, he and Katsuki moored the hopeful puffin on the rocky shore of one of the skerries that dotted the gentle sea around the peaceable country, and hunkered down in a relatively dry patch for the night. "I'll be back," Katsuki told him. "I need to speak to someone. She's an annoying piece of SHT, but she'll help us find our way around the library. Get some sleep, you look effin' terrible." Izuku was too tired to answer. He could only watch as Katsuki sprung into the sky, and then he made himself pull out a couple of rolls of thick, padded fur that Aizawa had packed them and creep off to find a relatively soft bit of ground to bundle himself up on. The night winds carried the sting of the incoming winter, and now that the pumping adrenaline was beginning to wear away, Izuku's hands and feet were numb with cold. Worst of all, there were no trees or low-growing shrubs like on Berk to field the worst of it. The skerry might have been a chunk of forgotten reef for how gnarled and knobbly it was. Izuku tucked his nose into the fur and, exhausted and shivering, waited for sleep to take him. Hours later, his shivering became so bad that it rattled him awake. Blearily, and still swaddled in furs, he staggered to his feet and towards the nearest heat source. Sighing, he found a gentle divot against something smooth and hard and so warm that the waves of heat traveled up and down his spine and thawed his freezing cold stomach and heart. Even his ears burned contentedly. The bond was warm too, soupy and syrupy, coating him like a second blanket. Within seconds, Izuku had dropped into unconsciousness again. He woke at dawn, surrounded by dragon. As he rubbed at his mouth and yawned, Izuku could have sworn he caught the red of Katsuki's eyes slanted in his direction, but when he shuffled around to face him, Katsuki was clearly asleep, puffing gentle rings of smoke from his nostrils. Izuku scrubbed his face and assessed his surroundings. Somehow, he'd ended up in the middle of a dragon Katsuki donut, spines and wings and scales encircling him on every side. He grimaced, wondering exactly what acrobatics he'd done while half asleep to end up here. Carefully, he eased himself over the narrow part of Katsuki's tail and climbed onto the deck of the boat to rummage through the rest of the supplies stored below deck. They had enough dried meat and fruit to last them about a week, and there were fishing spears and hunting bows, so food hopefully wouldn't be a concern. Aizawa had also stuffed large, waterproof sacks with clothes suitable for the coming winter. Izuku immediately pulled on a heavy coat and a woolly beanie, wondering if he could send him a care package or something in thanks. The last sack was definitely Grandma Chiyo's addition. Apart from more necklaces of hollow bones and gems and a copious amount of honey cakes wrapped in greased cloth, she'd also crammed in half a dozen notebooks, including the one Izuku had tentatively began drawing messy sketches in during dragon watching, and plenty of her strange feather pens and ink pots. "The F are you doing?" Izuku eeped and knocked his head on the rim of the cargo hatch. "Kaken, you're up. How are you feeling?" Katsuki studied him for a moment, and then, inexplicably flushed red high on the tops of his cheekbones. Izuku frowned worriedly, but Katsuki put his hand over Izuku's face and shoved his head away. "Like I slept on pile of rocks, dipshit. It's too early for your sunshine bullshit routine, put that the F away or I'll kill you." Izuku wordlessly handed him some honey cakes and sighed fondly as he stalked off to sit on the rim of the boat. After the first bite, Katsuki whipped his head around. "These are really effing good." Izuku joined him. "I know. Did that ugly granny make them?" Izuku bit into his own honey cake. "Don't be rude, Kaken, she's not ugly." "But yes. She better give me the DMN recipe or I'll kick her butt." The rest of Izuku's honey cake was a little hard to swallow. He'd never thought to ask for a recipe. And now this might be the last time he'd ever get to eat them. He could feel Katsuki eyeing him, so he did his best not to look as sad as he felt. Flour, oil, salt, honey, rising agent, milk, and some kind of F-in syrup to soak M with at the end. Izuku looked up. The ingredients. Probably. Katsuki was glaring at his cake. "Gimme a fire in half an hour and I'll make it. Who needs that stupid witch, anyway?" A wobbly smile stretched over Izuku's face. He didn't know if he'd been sending thoughts down their bond again of if Katsuki was just really good at reading his emotions, but it didn't matter. After they finished eating, Katsuki got up and stretched. "That library better be near here. I ain't sailing halfway across the world for some DMN books." "It is, actually. The hooligans and the meatheads are neighbors. But we can't dock there. The soldiers shoot on sight." Katsuki cracked his knuckles. "Good. No, Kaken. Not good. We don't want to be seen." "But you think I can't take them, is that it?" "I'm sure you can, but they're not evil. They're just soldiers. Listen, maybe we can sneak in or something. That way we might not even have to deal with the librarian, and hopefully the place is so big that we can be in and out before she even knows we were there." Katsuki grumbled something. That sounded suspiciously like piles and piles of useless, stupid Vikings, and of course I get the only F-in pacifist, but gestured for Izuku to get on his back. Izuku hesitated. "What about the boat? Then your friend?" "She's not my friend," Katsuki snapped. "I'll call her when I DMN well want to. And we'll be done before sunset. I'll fly us back here after. Hurry the F up or I'll go without you." Izuku decided not to point out that Katsuki didn't actually know the way and therefore couldn't go without him, and instead found a large, waterproof sealskin sack and folded it into a triangle to secure in his belt. "For the books," he told Katsuki, as he hooked his hands over his shoulders. "I know I ain't stupid." Izuku pointed Katsuki in the direction of Meathead territory once they took to the air. He'd see the huge map of the archipelago hanging in the Great Hall so often he basically had it memorized, and the Isle if Forget-Me wouldn't be more than a half-an-hour flight at Katsuki's speeds by his calculations. Sure enough, there it was, a great hulking shape emerging from the fog. Izuku's heartbeat quickened. Was this a quest? Did it count? It had all the important components. A perilous goal, a clear villain, high stakes, but, thought Izuku morosely, you have to be a Viking hero to go on a quest. And I'm not even a Viking anymore, let alone a hero. Katsuki slapped him with a tail spine. "Quit that. I'm trying to fly over here." He shouted, but he didn't really shout at all. Izuku pressed a hand to his head, feeling the bond ripple as it projected the words straight into his mind. "That's so weird." "Yeah. How'd you think I felt every day in that stupid forest?" "Sorry, thief." Just F in focus. The library was some kind of ancient, crumbling castle with slanting roofs and a large, heavy-looking gate. And it wasn't deserted. 𝗧𝗍𝗃 swore from inside Izuku's head. Hundreds and hundreds of soldiers, all with crossbows strapped to their backs and swords hanging from their waists, surrounded the battlements. And attached to chains wrapped around their wrists, fat purple dragons with shrunken wings, mean yellow eyes, and a single horn in the middle of their foreheads. Izuku gasped in horror. Kaken? Yeah, I know. But how did that happen? Why are they working for the Meatheads? Can't they just transform into humans and escape? There was grim silence on the other end of the bond. Izuku looked down at the dragons one more time as 𝗧𝗍𝗃 disappeared into the low-hanging clouds, and shook off the uncanny feeling that stuck to the back of his neck like moisture. Land on the roof. Don't give me orders. They landed on the roof. 𝗧𝗍𝗃 transformed back with a crunch and put his fingers to his lips as if he were about to whistle. Kaken, 𝗧𝗍𝗃, they're going to hear us. 𝗧𝗍𝗃 glared at him over his fingers and made an odd clicking noise at the back of his throat. A minute later, a writhing, colorful something fell from the sky and landed on the roof next to them. Izuku nearly jumped out of his tunic. The something was actually a long, bendy dragon, covered in frills. But before Izuku could get a proper look, it shifted into a pretty-looking girl with two small horns wiggling out from her short hair, completely black eyes with coins of gold in the middle. She was also completely pink. Hiya, she said, hopping over to Izuku and leaning on his shoulder. Wow, this place is really not it, you guys. I mean, unless you're going for dark and gloomy, then you've totally nailed it, but sheesh the gargoyles. Really? Talk about creepy. 𝗧𝗍𝗃 was thumbing the bridge of his nose. Deku, this is Mina. Mina, the pink girl, Mina, clapped her hands in apparent delight. Oh, this is Deku. Aren't you cute? I've heard so much about you from Mr. Grumpy Pants over here, but no one really believed him because who'd put up with that raging disaster for more than an hour I have no idea. 𝗧𝗍𝗃 slapped a hand over her mouth, gritting his teeth. Not another F-in word out of you or I'll turn you into a handbag, damn it. Hey. Mina chirped from behind his fingers. You better make it pretty. Izuku was having whiplash. It's nice to meet you. Mina grinned wide and peeled 𝗧𝗍𝗃's hand off her face. You too, babe, you too. Right? 𝗧𝗍𝗃 groused, looking angrier than usual. Here's the plan. We bust open the roof. Get the books. Get the F out. Kaken, we can't do that. Mina's head whipped between them. Kaken. What's a Kaken? Can I call him Kaken? Can I call you Kaken? 𝗧𝗍𝗃 turned to Mina, murder in his eyes. You want to try that again? Mina shrunk down. Izuku tapped the tips of his fingers together as 𝗧𝗍𝗃 apparently tried to set Mina on fire with his expression alone. Flux could kill. Over there, look, it's a window. The two of them followed Izuku's finger to a turret not too far away, and, sure enough, there was a collapsed little window stamped into the wall. The only one in the whole castle, it seemed. 𝗧𝗍𝗃 crossed his arms. I don't effin' like it. You don't like anything, Kaken. Mina flashed him a twinkling grin. Well, I certainly like you, Greenie. I have no idea what's going on, but I say let's go for it. 𝗧𝗍𝗃 curled his lip. Fine. But if it all goes to SHT, it ain't on me. And that was how Izuku found himself dangling by his fingertips, 𝗧𝗍𝗃 his legs this way, and that to avoid the hail of arrows embedding themselves in the castle walls, 𝗧𝗍𝗃 half out of the window in an attempt to hook his hands under Izuku's armpits and haul him inside. An ominous whirring noise rose up along with the second wave of arrows that narrowly missed taking off the end of Izuku's nose, and he made the mistake of looking down. The guards were taking their dragons off their chains. And was it Izuku's imagination, or were the strange horns in the center of the dragon's forehead rotating? 𝗧𝗍𝗃's hands froze on his shoulder blades. SHT, 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 F, SHT, Deku? I know. Izuku kicked at an arrow lodged beside his feet and stuck the toe of his shoe into the nick in the bricks, just as 𝗧𝗍𝗃 managed to get a good grip and drag him inside. They were only just in time. The first of those purple dragons snapped at Izuku's heels and missed by a centimeter, jagged teeth closing on nothing and horns spinning like a top in its forehead. It howled furiously and shoved its muscly shoulders into the window frame, cracking it wider as Izuku and Katsuki scrambled back. "Oh my god, what is that?" Mina screeched, pointing a pink finger at the horns slicing violently through the air. "Driller dragon." Katsuki and lobbed the closest thing he could reach, which happened to be a small marble statue of the goddess Freya, at the writhing beast, catching it between the eyes. Izuku watched in horror as the statue completely depressed a little raised bump the size of a large wart with a faint pop. 1 second the creature was plunging forwards, roaring manically, and the next it collapsed, limp, yellow eyes open and sightless. Izuku felt himself trembling faintly. Mina asked the question, hiding shy behind his teeth. "Is it dead?" "Yeah." "Squashed its brain." Katsuki was looking determinedly at the statue lying in 2 pieces on the floor. Izuku's hands were on his mouth. "𝗵𝗃𝗃, I'll explain later." Izuku shook his head furiously. "Explain now." "That 𝗃𝗃, that was a person." "How could you just, not a person?" Mina interrupted cheerfully, "More like a dragon zombie or something." Katsuki shifted over his feet, guilty. "𝗃𝗃, alright, it's okay. You know how I said, in ages ago or whatever, that all dragons can turn into humans. So you were lying then?" "No, Deku," Katsuki inhaled sharply, "they could once, I guess. Like 1,000 years ago or some such. Most of them have just lost the ability, the wild ones, the proper wild ones, they've forgotten what being human is like. You forget it, you lose it. And if you're born with no one to teach you, you've lost it from the beginning." Izuku glanced at the lifeless body of the dragon plugging the window. "These aren't wild dragons, though." Katsuki sighed. "Yeah. I figured you didn't know. Most of the tribes in your shitty archipelago keep useful," he sneered that word, eyes narrowing, "dragons captive. Chain them up and force them to work the ground or fight or carry SHT on their back like horses. And breed too. Those dragons forget their human forms the quickest. Between that and the war, there ain't many shifters left." Izuku felt sick. "Can't we help them or something?" "No," Katsuki said shortly, "the wild ones, we just leave them be 'cause they're peaceful. Ignorant, whatever. But the captive ones, we call them Nomu, they lose their humanity in a different way. Their mind goes like Frieza. They're violent and miserable, and they kill other dragons, humans, whatever. We try to kill him quick?" Izuku could feel Katsuki at the other end of their bond, hard, unfeeling steel. He could see it in his eyes, too. Izuku's heart ached. The war ran deeper than he'd ever known. He a bracing breath. "Let's find these books." Katsuki nodded and turned expectantly to Mina, who was politely pretending she hadn't been eavesdropping on their entire conversation. "Okie dokie. What section are we looking for?" Katsuki said, "History," at the same time Izuku said, "Myths and legends." Mina's gaze darted between them. I'm not too sure we'll have time for both. Those guards sound really angry." Izuku strained his ears. If he tried really, really hard, he could just make out the muffled thunder of hundreds of footsteps, the hollow beat of flapping wings, and that ominous whirring of the driller dragon's drills floors and floors below them. And their only escape route had been blocked by a very heavy-looking, very well-wedged-in purple obstacle. "Wonderful. Just go to the history section," Izuku told Mina, a touch hysterically, and Mina nodded and closed her eyes. 𝗃𝗃, Izuku threw into the bond, "how does Mina know her way around here?" "Her sense of direction is incredible," Katsuki replied, and it was still so strange to hear his familiar, gritty voice without his mouth moving to follow. "No idea why, and she won't tell. Keeps changing her goddamn answer. Shitty hair reckons it's magic, I reckon she doesn't know." Izuku clamped down on the urge to ask who Shitty Hair was, and began following Mina past into the labyrinth of dusty shelves. "Deku," said in his head Katsuki, deceptively casual, "don't touch the ground, all right?" Izuku, of course, peered suspiciously downwards. For a few seconds, nothing. "𝗃𝗃, please tell me I'm going insane right now." The floor was moving. A sinuous, writhing wriggle that was almost hypnotic to look at. Mina tossed a casual "what's that?" over her shoulder, blissfully ignorant. Izuku's stomach felt like it was going to fall right out of his boots. Nothing, Katsuki grunted, and then to Izuku. They're just red-hot itchy worms. Mina doesn't like them much, I don't want to deal with her whining. That's not a very nice-sounding name. Izuku thought loudly at Katsuki, loud enough for him to visibly wince. What are they? Why are there so many? Are they safe to walk on? Why can't I touch the ground? Calm the F down, Katsuki barked. They're just stupid little maggot dragons with a nasty F-in bite. They ain't gonna kill you. And they only swarm when they get a taste of flesh. Dumb alarm system if you ask me. Oh, because that's totally fine, Izuku thought wildly, bloodthirsty ground piranhas with an affinity for red meat. I feel so much better. I don't appreciate your F-in sarcasm. Cack in the ground wants to eat me. What, exactly, am I supposed to do in this situation? Bite you, not eat you. And you could start by shutting up, fuckface. Oh, that's so creepy, Mina said suddenly, and Izuku nearly leapt out of his skin. Mina was walking backwards, facing the two of them and looking hugely entertained. You two are totally doing that mind meld bond thing where you talk to each other inside your heads, right? Mind your business, raccoon eyes, Katsuki snapped, but Mina just giggled conspiratorially. You know, she whispered to Izuku, I've never seen him like this before. So chill. I really should thank you. Chill. Izuku thought privately. He'd hate to see what Katsuki was usually like if this was his chill. He was easily the most intense person Izuku had ever met. About everything. Apparently he'd sent that one down the bond, because Katsuki's narrowed eyes snapped to his. Izuku quickly pretended to be utterly absorbed in the surroundings. After a few moments, he didn't need to pretend any longer. The walls were lined with books. Thousands upon thousands of bookcases stretched from floor to ceiling, heavy with mildew and dust, lit only by the dim light of the occasional sticky glow worm. It was dark, and damp, and cold, and it smelled like old things, like secret things, like rotting paper and eltar and bitter ink and cobwebs. And maybe it was Izuku's imagination, but he couldn't shake the distinct feeling that they were being followed by something. But more than that, more than the eerie feel of the place and the prickling of the hairs on the back of his neck, Izuku couldn't believe the sheer amount of information locked up in this shadowy castle and away from all the people who could use it. To Izuku, who'd spent the last 8 months scouring 𝗵𝗃 limited book collection and trying and failing to write a coherent sentence so he could document his dragon watching, it was like entering a cave full of treasure. There were fat books, thin books, volume after decaying volume of the Encyclopedia Barbaria, guides to the archipelago, and to strange, lost, faraway lands that Izuku had never heard of, with names like jewels, Russia, China, India, Africa, and Japan. Most were in Latin. Some titles were written entirely in runes, or weird little pictures of birds and reeds and squiggles. He felt the familiar, dangerous burn of curiosity that had borne his longing to be a hero in the first place warm his fingers. They wandered for what felt like hours. You can take some, you know? Izuku eyed Katsuki warily. Are you sure? Isn't it stealing? Somehow, Katsuki managed to make a disapproving noise inside their own heads. Teeth. The only person who stole anything was the effer who locked this SHT up in the first place. F-in totalitarian bullshit. Izuku didn't know what totalitarian meant, but that was all the encouragement he needed. He promptly unfolded his sealskin sack and began carefully easing interesting-looking titles out from their places, whispering a guilty sorry to each one. He was pretty sure Katsuki was rolling his eyes behind him. Most of the books he took were about dragons, but Izuku snagged a couple of cooking ones for Katsuki. And after a moment's thought, some of those runic ones for 𝗵𝗃 and a slim number titled, Vikings and Their Sleep Schedules, How to Make the Most of Your 40 Winks, for Aizawa. Because he would see them again. He would. Here we go. Mina suddenly stopped in front of them and gestured to a rotting wooden sign that read history in droopy letters. He and Katsuki immediately fell to their knees and began scanning the shelves. Mina bounced down to join them. What are we looking for, guys? Katsuki ignored her. Anything about kings, Izuku whispered, fingering the dusty tomes, or lost things. Or lullabies. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 snorted at that one, but Mina nodded determinedly. On it, they spread out over the section. Occasionally, Mina or 𝗧𝗵𝗃 would find a promising-looking volume in Norse, which they couldn't read, and would call Izuku over to help. Or, well, Mina called him over. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 hauled him by the scruff of his neck and stuck the book right in his face. The history section was so huge that after 20 minutes of searching they'd barely scratched the surface. Concerningly, the drumming, flapping, whirring noises seemed to be getting imperceptibly closer. Or maybe that was Izuku's paranoia speaking. Iku. Don't you dare ignore me, damn it. Izuku snapped back into focus. 𝗧𝗵𝗃's face was very, very close to his. Izuku leapt backwards. 𝗧𝗃𝗃. Sorry, were you saying something? Instead of rolling his eyes and making some snide remark about Izuku being an airhead, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 leaned back in, breath ghosting over Izuku's ear. Don't freak out, but I'm pretty effing sure there's someone behind those shelves. Izuku's head swiveled round, but 𝗧𝗵𝗃 gripped his hair and rotated it back. The feeling, the pressure, scorched all the way down to Izuku's toes. Idiot. Why the F would you look? Am I interrupting something? Mina had apparently finished her row. She was watching them with the expression of a cat who'd gotten the cream. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 yanked his hand out of Izuku's hair like he'd been burned. Obviously not, you stupid pink freak. Mina's smile lengthened and sharpened, and she looked like she was about to reply when a shape slunk out from that dark corner that 𝗧𝗵𝗃 had been whispering about. Two short, flat knives appeared on either side of 𝗧𝗵𝗃's head. Silence in the library, giggled a high, shaky voice. Izuku felt a chill begin at the base of his spine. The voice belonged to a girl with hair nearly as blonde as 𝗧𝗵𝗃's, a hazy look in her cat-like eyes and a wide, toothy smile, wearing a strange tunic that seemed to be cut several inches too short. The library is closed, she cooed, dragging the flat of her blade up and down the side of 𝗧𝗵𝗃's neck. Who the F are you? 𝗧𝗵𝗃 said tightly, eyes wide and fixed on Izuku. The girl giggled again. I'm the librarian, silly. But you can call me Toga. Tell me your names, that way we can all be friends. Izuku couldn't stifle his gasp. The librarian. The infamous Flashmaster. Toga peeked over 𝗧𝗵𝗃's shoulders at the sound, and even in the dim light Izuku could see the flush that stole over her cheeks. Oh, she breathed, I like you. You're adorable. But you'd be so much cuter if you bled a little more, what do you think? Izuku's BLD went cold. Next to him, he heard the shiver of Mina drawing a sword he didn't even know she had. Toga. Nice to meet you, but we were totally just leaving, weren't we guys? Izuku nodded. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 couldn't, because it would mean cutting his own head off. But what about those books you've got there? Stealing is wrong, you know. She angled the tip of her blade at their sack. Izuku clutched the books to his ear. He couldn't just leave them shut away in the darkness to be chewed on by termites. And besides, they still hadn't found what they'd come here for. Izuku said firmly, steeling his spine, it's wrong for you to keep them all here. People should be allowed to come and read. Toga's smile widened like a cat's, flush seeping and spreading. Oh ho, you have such a nice voice. Stop talking to him. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 snarled and sent an elbow into Toga's stomach. She leapt back and twitched her blades, eyeing the line of 𝗧𝗵𝗃's neck hungrily. So that's how it is, huh? You want to come between us? Honestly, you're not my type, but I'll cut you anyway. She darted forwards, knife poised like she was about to slice open 𝗧𝗵𝗃's jugular, and Izuku had time for a brief flash of panic before Mina moved and knocked it away with her sword. From this angle, Izuku recognized it as one of the ones he'd given 𝗧𝗵𝗃 months ago in their forest basin, and by the looks of the way Mina was holding it, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 had taught her how to use it. You too? Toga shrieked, that's so unfair, he's mine. I called dibs. She zipped out of Mina's range and dived for Izuku, but 𝗧𝗵𝗃 parried her with his own sword that he'd apparently stuffed down the back of his tunic. His mouth was a hard, mean line. Kaken! Izuku shouted frantically, swordless and sort of panicking, what do I do? Find the book, idiot! 𝗧𝗵𝗃 shouted back. Find it, Anne. Whatever 𝗧𝗵𝗃 was about to say was cut off by Toga making a vicious swipe at him with the knife in her right hand and one at Mina with the knife in her left. The clang of the two of them blocking the blows was gobbled up by the musty darkness all around. Move. Toga hissed, slashing and swiping. I want to talk to him, get out of the way. Katsuki was great at sword fighting and Mina wasn't half bad either, but Toga used her knives like an extension of her limbs, and she was so quick that it made up for her shorter reach. In fact, Izuku could tell by her footwork that if she wasn't so desperate to leap over their heads and get to him, Katsuki and Mina would likely have been ribbons on the floor 30 seconds ago. Izuku! Katsuki yelled. Move. Izuku moved. Oh, don't be like that. Come back here, cutie, Toga called as Izuku clattered through the shelves. You'll look so pretty under my knife, and it'll much better than waiting for those driller dragons to get here. There's such a yucky way to die. The dragons? Izuku had forgotten about them. Fingers trembling, he thumbed book after book, desperately searching for anything on royal bloodlines, Viking war history, anything, a line of phantom heat on Izuku's arm, and Katsuki's pained grunt from a shelf away. Izuku froze, hands stilling. She'd hurt Katsuki. She'd hurt Katsuki. Only a little BLD. That's such a shame. Izuku felt himself grow sharp and cold. Quiet. A chilly anger swept through him like a blizzard. She would not get a chance to do it again. Izuku's mind whirred, rapid fire and analytical. He could hear Toga moving like a whirlwind, crowing Izuku, the floor still writhing with red-hot itchy worms. There were dusty books waiting in rows before him. Grabbed the thickest one he could find, a comprehensive study of nonviolent war tactics and their efficacy. Ears full of cotton, Izuku crept to the back of the aisle. Katsuki and Mina were still fighting in. They were. Izuku could see Mina's sword arm shaking faintly. Their tunics were in shreds, but the skin beneath was clear, almost like Toga was toying with them as she hopped nimbly around the bookcases and under and out of their reaches, knives flashing, swipe, slash, zing, rip. Izuku slunk forward on silent feet, book aloft. The beads of red on Katsuki's forearm. Izuku swung the book as hard as he could at Toga's bobbing, blonde head. It made contact with a satisfying thunk, and Toga, who was already off balance from trying to swivel round to see who was behind her, lost her footing and toppled onto the library floor, bare legs meeting the infested carpet. The itchy worms swarmed up her legs in their trillions, biting into whatever flesh they could reach like a ravenous pack of tiny coyotes, probably delighted by the endless expanse of fresh meat. Toga screamed. She screamed and screamed and screamed, knives falling away as she desperately clawed at her legs, batting at the invisible army of sharp little fangs, voice like a siren in the gaping emptiness of the library. She fell, leapt up, fell again, until finally, scratching desperately, she sprinted out of the aisle and into the darkness, shrieking, Izuku! Izuku! I'll see you soon, Kay. Stumbling and tripping and all the while. The low murmur of sound rising from far below paused for a tense second. Like the library was holding its breath. And then, roaring. And the sound of a crowd of padding feet, first walking, and then breaking into a shuddering, springing run, the triumphant noise of hundreds of driller dragons who had been desperate for something to eat and might have finally found it. Katsuki swore, grabbing Mina and Izuku by their sleeves and hauling them further into the maze of bookcases. We've got to get out of here. Now effing now. What about the book? Izuku running after him. Can't read a book if you're a effing kebab. Come on. Deku. Mina beamed from beside him. That was crazy. Thanks a bunch. I was so sure we were goners. Izuku offered a shaky smile back, dodging her sword that swung back and forth as she pumped her arms. And no problem, thanks for fighting that girl, Toga. She was really creepy. Katsuki scoffed as they leapt over a roll in the carpet. Can't believe she was the librarian. Ain't she supposed to old or some? Maybe she was old, Mina said in between breaths. A good skincare routine can do wonders, you know. Izuku laughed manically, partly at Mina, partly at the absolute lunacy of their situation. He'd just attacked a person. Izuku. Well, he'd hit her with a book, and she'd fallen, literally, into an unfortunate situation, but still. That cold, calculating feeling was draining now, leaving only the jittery aftershocks of adrenaline and a disbelieving sort of numbness. And a distant hope that she'd be okay. They skidded round a corner to find a lone driller dragon, one that must have broken off from the stampeding pack, poised to spring. Mina screamed and toppled a bookcase on top of it. On they ran through the cavernous labyrinth, Mina attempting to guide them towards the walls of the castle so they could smash through and out, but stray driller dragons forcing them to double back on themselves just as often. "Kakin!" Izuku gasped. "Kakin, turn into a dragon and let's fly out of here." He gulped a mouthful of air. "Your fire melts stone. We burn the books and the whole effing place will blaze." Katsuki shouted back. "I ain't about that SHT+, we haven't found that DM in lullaby." "I can't run anymore," Mina huffed, clutching her side. I'm done, I'd rather fight my way out." Katsuki stopped too, face grimly determined. "Yeah. We'll murder those demon extras, get out your sword." And then he began stacking books into piles by the entrance, as if that would stop a horde of feral, hungry Nomu. "Help me, damn it, we'll effin' them." As Katsuki and Mina got to work on the shoddy barricade, Izuku looked around the room they'd ended up in, desperate for a hidden weapon or an exit point or a book on killing loads of savage dragons, anything that could help them, and then his eye caught a gleam of brightness in one far corner. Izuku squinted, checked again. A book on the bookshelf opposite appeared to be glowing. All around it was a bright CHK of light, as clear as day. And as Izuku stepped towards it, he gave a gasp of astonished amazement. Yoichi, the last king of the Wilder West, was right there, in curling gold letters along the book's spine. Now, there are those of us who do not believe in silly things like fate, and there are those of us who do. But in this enormous, great, tangled book warren of a library, which must have had thousands and thousands of rooms in it, each with hundreds and hundreds of books, the room the three of them ended up in happened to be the only one with a book titled Yoichi, the Last King of the Wilder West, buried in amongst other titles like Young Bog Burglar naming documentation, and yew trees and other old traditions. What are the odds of that? Minuscule. 1 in a millionth million, prof. But there was. "Guys," he whispered, reaching for the book as if hypnotized, "I found a book. On the shelf, Katsuki scoffed. "No, stupid Deku, we're surrounded by them, but a fuckton of angry Nomus are about to find us, so why don't you get your butt over here and help?" He was interrupted by a loud, long creak as the shelf that Izuku had just pulled the book from clicked cheerfully and swung wide open. "Whoa," Mina said, peering into the exposed tunnel and the glorious blue circle of light at the end of it. "How'd you do that?" Izuku looked down at the book in his hand, thick and embossed, and then back up at the tunnel, at the engraving of Norse on the stone archway, "The Dragon Whisperer's Way." "I have no idea. Who f***ing cares how, thank your lucky stars later." That was Katsuki, snatching the book out of Izuku's hand and stuffing it into their already overflowing sack. He began to clamber inside, but Izuku threw out an arm to stop him. The tunnel wasn't empty. There were sleeping dragons, about the size of largish newts, scattered in handfuls on the cobblestones. Dragons Izuku recognized from months of dragon watching, dragons he'd seen take down animals as large as stags in a quarter of a second with one bite of their tiny fangs. Sure enough, there were the poison glands pulsing under the thin skin of their scaly necks as they shifted restlessly, still asleep but waking up very, very quickly. Katsuki swore. "𝗧𝗵𝗲𝗺𝗵. No, of course." Mina backed away. "Guys, I have dinner plans. I really can't die here. Ain't nobody dying. Cool your effin' jets." Izuku's mind was whirring. He knew there was a way to subdue these, what had Katsuki called them, piffleworms. He specifically remembered attempting and failing to write it down in his notebook next to his pathetic sketch of the little dragon. He closed his eyes desperately. Was it rubbing their stomach with the end of a nettle? No, that were those spotty yellow dragons up in the canopies, glowing in their eyes. No, that were those dark-colored nano-dragons that hid in nightshade plants. "Do you think we can tiptoe over them without waking them up?" Mina whispered. As if in answer, the nearest piffleworm opened its eyes briefly, yawning around its little forked tongue so wide a drop of venom fell from a fong and sizzled a hole into the stone below. The piffleworm fell asleep again. Deadly poison or lethal drills. It seemed that their luck had run out. Stay behind me, Deku. Katsuki pushed him backwards, facing the haphazard wall of books they'd built with his sword drawn, the sound of the approaching driller dragons so loud they might as well have been in the same room. And then it occurred to Izuku, the little birds in the forest. They'd had never been bitten by any of the piffleworms even though they were as numerous as insects because... Start whistling, he shouted over the sound of the stampede. It makes them freeze. They won't be able to bite us. You sure? Katsuki yelled over his shoulder. No, Izuku said back, but do it anyway. It's surprising how hard it is to whistle in a life-or-death situation. The piffleworms were rousing now, looking disgruntled at the awful racket, poison glands swelling in preparation like an ugly army of winged bullfrogs. All three of them tried their hardest to move their stiff with adrenaline face muscles, but the most they managed was a wheezy puff or a hollow, windy sound. Until Katsuki gripped Izuku's face in one hand and hauled him close. Izuku's lips were forced into a pucker, and Katsuki's warm finger pads were surely digging bruises under his freckles, but he went limp like he'd been scruffed. Whistle, Katsuki hissed, right next to his face, and a line of heat zinged straight from Izuku's toes to his stomach to his spine and then back around again. Katsuki smelled sweet and charred and nothing at all like the stale air of the library. Izuku suddenly found that he could. Within a few wobbly notes, every single piffleworm had frozen, mouths open, into ugly dragon gargoyles. Get in, Katsuki bellowed, using his hold on Izuku's face to practically shove him into the tunnel, then hauling Mina in after them by her pink hair, and keep in whistling. The three of them scrambled on all fours through the tunnel and towards that appealing window of freedom, knocking still frozen piffleworms that watched them pass like vengeful chess pieces. Behind them, two fully formed driller dragons sprung into the room, screaming, drills whirring, and began to shove their way into the tunnel behind them. Go, go, go! Katsuki roared, and still clutching Izuku and Mina, he flung them out into the open air. Back on Berk, All Might had not slept at all. In fact, he laid in bed until noon, massive hands over his face, regretting his solemn pronouncement the night before. What kind of father put his laws before the life of his son? But then again, what kind of son would fail the laws that his father had looked up to and believed in all his life? Why had Izuku defended that dragon, and why had he refused to explain himself? There'll be other sons, he'd been telling himself firmly, but the wind and the rain and the rattling walls of the village seemed to howl back at him, but not like Izuku. By the time the sun was high in the sky, All Might had made the awesome decision to cast his vote beside Chiyo's and reverse Izuku's banishment. It is weak of me, weak, he thought morosely as he dressed and made his way into the village. Squidface the Terrible would have banished his son in the twinkling of an eye. Loudmouth the Gouty would have positively enjoyed it. What is the matter with me? I should be banished myself, and no doubt that is what the rest of those blasted elders are going to suggest. All's to say, All Might was really not in the mood to deal with the crowd that had gathered outside the Great Hall. He trudged up to Aizawa, who was lingering on the edge. What's going on? His eyes flicked to his briefly. All Might couldn't help but think the man looked slightly smug, which was a strange expression indeed on Aizawa's usually impassive face. Izuku's gone. Gone. All Might blanched and, without waiting for Aizawa's response, shouldered past the crowd. Excuse me, there's a lad, sorry about that, let me through please, by Thor let me through, and practically fell down the stairs to the underground dungeon to find the sad remains of the door slathered all over the cobblestones like spilled paint and... No Izuku. Toga watched from the rock pools as the horde of driller dragons rose as one and flapped after the three escaping book thieves, their dumb, ugly guards shouting and banging their shields in the courtyards behind them. She stretched out her legs, letting the salt water detach the last of the itchy worms, and grumbled to herself about the stacks of reports she was going to have to write later for all her missing books. So not fun. She'd only taken this job because the big hairy men had promised her she'd have lots of chances to stab people, and she hadn't even gotten to do that today. But she did get to meet. Toga squealed into her hand, the memory of wide green eyes tipping her back into the water. Izuku. Izuku. She tested the name on her lips and squealed again. Izuku. Izuku. Zuku. Zuki baby. Ugh, she wanted to go after him. She'd only bleed him a little. He wouldn't even notice, he'd be too busy looking up at her with those green eyes. Oh, it was so much fun to have a crush. Toga hadn't had one in ages. All too soon, she felt the skin around her fingers and face begin to sag, the hair over her eyes bristle. She huffed. That stupid library, and her stupid contract. All for one tiny book. She couldn't even remember what it was called. Briefly, she wondered if those annoying brats, not Izuku, never Izuku, had taken it. But no, they couldn't have possibly found it. Toga got to her feet, squeezing the water out of her skirt. Maybe she'd check the dragon whisperer's way. Just in case. Katsuki's great, black wings unfolded in midair as he shifted, forcing Izuku to cling desperately to the jut of one of his spines as they streaked away, the island and pursing driller dragons falling behind them. I'll distract them. Meet me at the southern feeding grounds. Mina shouted over the rush of the wind, and she threw herself off and coiled into her dragon form, wings extending as she banked away. Izuku called out for her, but his hand was slammed back by the sheer speed they were traveling at. Katsuki steered straight towards a furrow of a canyon that Izuku recognized as the divide between the North and South Meathead Islands, the sharp of his wing leaving vapor trails in their wake. Izuku stiffened the muscles in his neck so his head wouldn't fly off, and peeked over the side. Over the froth of turbulent waters, he could just make out the sealskin sack Katsuki had clutched in one careful claw. Then a needle-sharp rock emerged from the mist, and Katsuki tucked his claw under his body again. Driller dragons are territorial litter FRs, his voice echoed around Izuku's head, the bond tight and twined. If we get far enough, they'll stop following. Does Mina know? She'll figure it out quick. Hold on. Izuku flattened himself against Katsuki's back, trying to minimize the drag of the wind as best he could as the top of the canyon narrowed and squeezed them downwards. Katsuki swerved this way and that to avoid the rocks, slaloming through the surf as spray drenched Izuku's sleeves. Where are we going? What are the southern feeding grounds? I'll show you. First we gotta get back to that boat. Izuku chewed on his lip. Kaken, I don't think that's going to be far enough. I'll make it far enough. Shut up and pray to your shitty gods that that book you found was worth the F in trouble. Izuku did as he said, murmuring prayers to Thor as he hunkered down over Katsuki's warm scales. Katsuki seemed so self-assured, like he was certain everything would work out, like nothing could ruffle him. Meanwhile, Izuku felt like he was knee-deep in one of the bogs back on Berk and sinking fast. Maybe Mina wouldn't get out. Maybe the driller dragons would catch up to them after all, and then Izuku would have put Katsuki in danger again. Maybe the book he'd risked their lived for was the wrong one, and they opened it only to find some stuffy dissertation about banquets, or whatever kings did in their spare time. Most of all, Izuku was worried about those poor gnomes. The image of the chained collars and thick, roping scars he'd seen on the driller dragons played behind his eyes. Izuku needed some answers. Eventually, the silhouette of the hopeful puffin emerged below them, a raisin of brown on the sheet of slate grays and steely blues. Katsuki dropped the sack of books unceremoniously on the deck, shifted, and roared at Izuku to go faster, damn it, as he unwound ropes, checked the mast and spreaders, opened the sail, and pushed them off the skerry. Izuku sat by the rudder and steered in the directions Katsuki pointed, trying to ignore the screaming of the driller dragons above and stiffening every time one of them got too close. But they made it. The southern feeding grounds turned out to be somewhere the Vikings called the Sullen Sea, a narrow strip of unruly ocean that existed between the Isle of Villainy and Bohem territories. Their little boat tipped and rocked as Izuku anchored it in the shallowest part of the bay, and then again each time a wave swelled and crashed against its wooden sides. Together, they settled in to wait. Do you think, Izuku's lips, do you think Mina got out okay? Katsuki grunted. She's fine. Her species got this crazy corrosive acid that they shoot out instead of fire. Driller dragons are f***ing dumb, they'll fly right into it. Amina's fest. Yes. Don't tell her I said that or I'll kill you. Izuku nodded absent-mindedly, fiddling with the flap of the book sack. Katsuki followed his gaze. Kicked his ankle. Oi. Don't look at it like that if in baby dear eyes. Who killed your mother? No one's telling you not to open it. Izuku nudged him back. Don't you want to wait for Mina? Mina doesn't know about any of it, Katsuki scoffed. She owed me a favor, that's it. I ain't involving any extras in this HTTYD until we know it's not some practical joke from your grandma crackhead. Izuku bit his lip against asking more about what Katsuki could have done to put Mina in his debt, and instead drew out 𝗧𝗍𝗪, the last king of the Wilder West. The cover was thick and leathery and well-worn, finger-shaped divots pressed along the spine. Izuku traced it reverently, and, with Katsuki pretending not to peer over his shoulder, flipped it open. There was a warning on the first page, written in large, ink-smudged capitals. Warning: read this book and you will die. We all die, murmured Izuku to himself. Eventually. He turned to the next page. We all die. Eventually. Izuku laughed aloud. What's it say? Katsuki snapped. Stupid F in Norse. It looks like shitty chicken scratch. Is that a letter or a fish? Who knows? Not me, dumbass Vikings. Where are the spaces? Izuku patted him on the shoulder. Nothing important yet, Kaken. I promise I'll let you know. Katsuki grumbled and groused, barely mollified, but let Izuku turn over the page again. There was a little dedication in the center, black characters dissolving with age. To my brother, all my love and forgiveness. Here is your hope. Izuku frowned. What a strange thing to write. The next page was written in a different hand. Izuku gasped when he read the first line. Kaken. Kaken, it's the lullaby. Katsuki batted his hands out of the way, peering at the paper. Are you sure? Is it the same as your version? I don't know, I can't see. Read it? I'm trying. Would you just do... Katsuki had picked him up by the sides of his tunic and pulled him flush to his side, thigh to thigh, so close that their hair brushed. Katsuki slammed the book onto Izuku's lap and jabbed a finger at the lines. Read. Out loud. The whole thing. Izuku couldn't even look at him properly without risking their noses bumping. Everywhere they touched was burning, tugging on the bond between them, curling light and fire that singed Izuku's cheeks red. Izuku saw Katsuki raise an unimpressed eyebrow at the edges of his fuzzy vision. He swallowed, made himself clear his throat. Do you want to skip the first part? Already, yesterday, I told you the lullaby, right? It looks similar, or exactly the same actually. What part of the whole thing didn't sink into your thick head? Right? Sorry. Here goes. Izuku in a breath. In forests wide and valleys deep, in darkened caves and mountains steep, a noble quest awaits the brave, the pure of heart, the unafraid. 10 lost things whose kingly lights draw heroes to their final heights. With swords ablaze they seek the trail, yet none return to tell the tale. He who finds them whence they lain. I remember this part, Katsuki interrupted, breath ghosting over Izuku's cheek. Find the things so you can be crowned on whatever the F. Beware of the F in monsters hiding under your bed. Blah blah blah, bunch of predictable but rhyming couplets. Kaken, that isn't very nice. I'm sure the author spent a lot of time coming up with it. Not enough, clearly. Skip it. I thought you wanted me to read the whole thing. Yeah, I didn't know how effin' slow you'd be, did I? How is it that your mouth blabs on at maximum speed at all other hours of the day, for God's sake? A dragon's heart in gentle hands, Izuku said loudly over the top of him, to forge a knot which time withstands, and on his arm, a Roman shield, to serpents I do soldiers yield. My favorite sword hangs at his side, the baleful edge to slay his pride. He wears a ruby stone of fates, for lovers fall at devil's gates. Izuku's tongue felt heavy, like the words were actual, physical weights that required heft and effort. His arrow which does not exist hails from lands of sun and myth. And from man's clever, cunning sense, a ticking thing emerges hence. By iron key in faithful hand no lock, or door, or chain will stand. And at his back a cursed throne, on which he will not sit alone. Within a mountain's secret keep, his crown awaits in ancient sleep, and last and best of all the 10, the dragon jewel shall save all men. Even the ocean seemed to have slowed to listen. Izuku swallowed around his numb tongue, ignoring the spitting and sputtering electric energy that the bonds stung along his scar. Katsuki was frowning. The dragon jewel? He asked, voice low. Swear I've heard that somewhere before. Izuku rubbed a finger over the faded ink, mind spinning. He had a sneaking suspicion he knew what a couple of these objects were referring to, and if he was right, they were in big trouble. Oh yeah, you want to share with the class, or? Izuku shook his head firmly and pulled himself out of the bond. We have to read the rest of it first. What? There's more? I think so. There are heaps of pages left. Let's see then. Izuku flicked through the rest of the book, but it seemed to be empty. What the F? Katsuki grabbed the book and rifled through it again. That's it? Careful, Kaken. That book is probably really old. You're going to tear it? Good. It'll f***ing deserve it. All that work for some useless but bedtime story. We're going back. You need a different book. One with more words. No wait, there are clues in there. Kaken, just listen. My favorite sword hangs at his side. I think I know what that one is. And the shield one is obvious. We could get that today. There are Roman ships crawling all over the edge of the archipelago. It would be easy to board at night and to nick it. Shield from somewhere without anyone even batting an eye. Katsuki paused with the book above his head. Emboldened, Izuku continued, you said you know something about the dragon jewel, right? That's 3. And I'm sure we can figure out the rest. There are hints all over the place. I just need some time. I have this feeling about it. The 𝗧𝗵𝗃 of light in the musty darkness of the library, the dragon whisper's way passage that opened up around it. I think this book is important. Please don't throw it in the ocean. Katsuki lowered his arms. Izuku let out a breath of relief. So you buy this HTTYD then? I don't know. Like, a ruby stone worn by fate. An arrow that doesn't exist. A ticking thing. It sounds like the grocery list of a crazy person. But someone obviously wrote them down, and unless that someone was 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧𝗵𝗃, then at least 2 people in the world know more about the idea of the lost things than we do. We should at least look into it. Not that that really proves anything, Izuku didn't add. And say they did gather all these hypothetical things, then what? The war would magically disappear. Izuku's exile would be forgotten by the whole of the hooligan tribe. Not likely. He bit his lip. And you're right. I'm sort of curious. Maybe. Katsuki must have known all that, but he only rolled his eyes. You're such a nerd, you know. It's f***ing embarrassing. Hey. Izuku spluttered, I saw you sneak some books into the sack. I'm not the only nerd here. The tips of Katsuki's ears flared red. Lie it. You didn't see HTTYD. I so did. Admit it, you're just as bad. You couldn't waterboard that CRP out of me. Think denial common in situations like these, Kaken. Don't feel bad. Who's feeling bad? You maybe your brain is all messed up, shithead. You sure you can even think with that crusty butt animal on your head? My hair. Yeah, your hair. It's f***ing filthy. Izuku squeaked in embarrassment and shot away from Katsuki's grip, and then paused. Wait, no. I've been exiled. And given an impossible quest. Excuse me if washing my hair hasn't been on the top of my priorities list. Katsuki's lip curled. First chance I get I'm chucking you in a pond, stinky. Kaken. Katsuki snickered into his palm as Izuku wailed and shook his shoulder, and that was how Mina found them as she twirled gracefully down from the sky. Cozy, she said, you don't smell by the way. Don't mind cats, he's not kennel trained. Katsuki snapped his teeth at her. Mina. Izuku leapt to his feet, the boat rocking. I'm so glad you're okay. He tried to look her over, but she waved him away. I'm fine. You're too cute, I promise. I don't even have a scratch. Wow, Izuku marveled, there were hundreds and hundreds of those driller dragons. You must be an amazing flyer. Mina flicked pink bangs out of her eyes, looking pleased. You know it, and then at Katsuki's lethal glare. Anyway, I'm gonna grab us dinner. What are you feeling? Get him salmon, Katsuki grunted, and don't F it up with your teeth. Mina saluted and sprung off the deck. Her shifting looked different to Katsuki's. Gentler, maybe, unfurling out of her skin like a fern in the sun. Mouth open, she dived into the water and stayed under for ages, far longer than Izuku could hold his breath for. Izuku was fascinated, his fingers itching for a pen. If only he could write his observations down. I can hunt like that, Katsuki said suddenly. His brows were low and sullen, glaring at the spot Mina had last been. I know. Izuku replied, baffled. Had he said something down the bond accidentally? I'm faster too. And I can fit more fish in my mouth. Izuku was really confused. Congratulations. Katsuki looked at him for a long, hard moment, then huffed. Whatever. Forget it. He stalked away to the prow of the boat. Mina returned not long after with a huge salmon flapping between her jaws. Izuku didn't look, stomach squirming, as the two of them killed, skinned and filleted it with the very edges of their swords. Here. Katsuki handed him a pile of salmon cubes wrapped in greased cloth and a full water skin. Izuku blinked up at him in surprise. Thank you. Whatever. He could feel Katsuki's eyes on him as he hesitantly popped a piece of fish past his lips. It was surprisingly good. Really good, actually, almost buttery, rich and a little briny but not overly so. It hardly tasted like fish at all. Izuku finished the pile under Katsuki's careful watch. There was something on his striking face as he handed Izuku another bundle. Izuku didn't have time to analyze it before he turned away. Mina ate with them, seagulls wheeling above, and graciously allowed Izuku to spend the entire time pestering her with questions. So you still have your horns in this form? Not all of us look like completely human, that would be so boring. That's so cool, Izuku gushed, and Kaken said you could spit acid instead of fire. How does that work? Mina grinned toothily at him. No idea, babe. She pursed her lips, whoosh, and then yeah. Everyone's melted. Wow, Izuku whispered, clutching his hands together. That's incredible. It doesn't corrode your teeth or anything. Sure does. I grow them back every time. You do? Katsuki rolled his eyes. No, she doesn't. She's just messing with you. Izuku turned back to Mina. Are you? She giggled and waggled a finger. Maybe. Izuku laughed. What about you, Greenie? Any special powers? Izuku sunk into himself slightly. Oh. No, I don't. I'm just human. You're not just anything, Katsuki barked. F off with that. You think I would have bonded to any wimpy but loser? Izuku felt his heart skip. Kaken. Do you mean that? Die. Izuku cupped his flaming cheeks as Mina cackled, upsetting the pyramid of salmon bones they'd left on a barrel. Blasty. Look at you, words of affirmation. You've been holding out on us. Shut up, shut up, shut up. Mina was still laughing as she got to her feet. I think that's my cue to leave, boys. Things to do, people to see, you know. Have fun. But not too much fun. She blew a still steaming Katsuki a kiss, and wrapped Izuku in a tight hug. It was so nice to meet you, she whispered, squeezing. I'll see you soon, okay? Look after your Kaken for me. He's not, what? Izuku spluttered, but she just patted him on the head and jumped gracefully into the sky. One last twirl, and she was nothing but a breath of wind and the faint scent of strawberries. Come on, Katsuki grumbled, tugging awkwardly at the sails. We gotta get to shore. Can't sleep on this stupid boat. Izuku had been so preoccupied with Mina that he hadn't noticed the sun was slowly creeping its way towards the distant treeline. Right? He replied, blinking away his confusion, and tugged the ropes out of Katsuki's hands. Soon enough, they found another little island to land on. It wasn't even an island, really, just a gray beach and a modest thicket of trees, but it would do. Katsuki helped his drag the nose of the boat ashore, and they set off a little way into the tiny forest to set up camp for the night. Nerd. Katsuki inclined his head towards a shiny bit of ground. There's your bath. Izuku peered at what was, on closer inspection, a burbling pond, so clear in the dying daylight that he could see the smooth rocks locked together at the bottom. What about you? I'll go after. Katsuki chucked a brick of soap and a clean tunic at him. Hurry the F up, my eyes are watering. I don't even smell like anything. Izuku said indignantly, nose stuffed in his armpit. What is your problem? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe that nest on your dumb head offends me. You ever think of that? Izuku huffed and stalked towards the pond, muttering angrily as he stripped and eased himself into the cold water. He was still muttering as he lathered the soap between his hands. His fingers caught and snagged as he scrubbed aggressively through his tangled hair, once, twice, dunking his head backwards to rinse it. "What are you doing?" Izuku froze mid-dunk. Katsuki was examining him from the edge of the pond like Izuku was a particularly ugly fish. "Washing," he snapped, wringing his bangs. "What does it look like?" "Like you're turning that thing into a carpet?" "If by that thing you mean my hair, then I don't see how it's any of your business," he sniped, foaming up the soap again. "Are you even gonna brush it?" And then when Izuku didn't reply, "Hey, don't effing ignore me." Izuku dunked his head again. No, he wasn't going to brush it. He really wasn't in the mood to have another comb die on him halfway through. There was a whole section of Valhalla dedicated to the generations of them that had lived and died in Izuku's stubborn locks. Suddenly heat. Katsuki's hand was on the nape of his neck, when had he gotten that close? Squeezing, nails biting slightly, sending frisons down Izuku's spine. "W-chan. What are you doing?" Rescuing this, Katsuki said from somewhere above him, and led him towards the flat of a submerged rock closer to the bank with the hold he had on Izuku's neck. "You either let me effing fix it for you or I swear I'll hack it off in your sleep." Izuku was too startled to speak. He felt his eyelashes flutter at the first touch of Katsuki's fingers roughly scraping the hair back from his forehead. A trickle of something cold, colder than the water, onto his hair made him flinch. "What's that?" he shivered, heart-rabbiting, shoulder bumping into the warm mound of Katsuki's knee. Oh, he must have sat at the water's edge. "Aloe vera?" Katsuki's voice was low. "For the effing mat you got going on here?" The teeth of some comb he must have found in their supplies dragged briefly against the crown of Izuku's head. Involuntarily, he leaned up into the touch. Katsuki paused for a second, then did it again, catching briefly on the shell of Izuku's ear. Okay, they were doing this. Izuku was totally not panicking. He curled his legs and crossed his arms over his teeth, trying to surreptitiously shift away from Katsuki's radiating heat, but was stopped by the hand in his hair. "Why, you don't have to," Izuku's voice trailed off, lips half in the water. "Yeah," Katsuki replied, but began to gently, detangle the ends of the first clump, holding the base of the hair tight to Izuku's head to stop it from tugging. Shuddering heat thrilled through his body at each perfect, painful point of pressure, Katsuki's balled-up knuckles pressing against the knob of his neck to get him to tip backwards even further. "Kaken. Would you just let me?" The words were strangled and soft and careful, like they were breaking apart in Katsuki's mouth, and that warm hand was passing over Izuku's eyes, sliding his lids closed. It was a strange, liminal pace, the pond, the low wash of the sun, gold, then orange, all neon peach through his eyelids, then purple and bruised as Katsuki worked the aloe into his hair from root to tip and washed it out with handfuls of water. It felt so good, so shivery and floaty and unreal after the adrenaline of the day. Izuku almost didn't notice himself drifting into sleep. Izuku's head lolled into the feeling of Katsuki smoothing his hair back over and over. Had they finished? "Are you seriously sleeping?" Katsuki's voice was tight and high with restrained laughter, and oh, it sounded so nice, and then Katsuki scratched his nails against the naked bit of scalp right on his temples, and Izuku arched into it like a cat. "God, you're not even in here, are you?" Katsuki mumbled, and Izuku couldn't really make sense of the words, only the warmth at his back, and the tingling in the tips of his fingers and toes. Above him, Katsuki sighed. "Bedtime, loser. Come on. Get out." Half awake, Izuku clutched Katsuki's arms as he was hauled out of the water and swaddled in a thick towel that smelled like soap and home. He yawned, and Katsuki passed a hand through his hair again. The bond was so sweet around him, just like the towel, except warmer. Somehow, Izuku was able to stuff himself into a tunic and socks, Katsuki's hands flitting in and out of his vision, and then he was even cozier, suddenly, and more sleepy. A brush of something tender against his forehead, "Good night, dork," whispered into his drying hair, and then not much of anything at all. Izuku woke with the dawn. The burnt-out remains of a campfire he didn't remember setting up smoldered faintly a couple of feet away. The deep orange burn illuminated the circle of ragged hair topping off an ungainly lump next to it. Katsuki, who must have started the fire. Because Izuku had been asleep. Because Katsuki had. Izuku's hands flew up to feel through his unusually soft, tangle-free hair, cheeks hot. Not a dream. As if reminding him, the sensation of Katsuki's hands ghosted over Izuku's skin. He curled over his rapidly tightening stomach. Usually, it was Izuku who initiated contact between them, sitting close, nudging Katsuki's shoulder, his ankle, although that wasn't quite true, was it? Katsuki had been much more physical with him now than he'd been 8 months ago. Izuku wondered if he was ill. Or maybe this was just what close friends did with each other. It wasn't like Izuku had any other metric to compare it to, and dragons might have totally different parameters for their relationships on top of all that. A sound theory indeed, and it only became more so the longer Izuku thought about. What other reason could Katsuki have? The thought settled like a stone, heavy and sure, and made him want to sink right back into sleep. He made a valiant attempt, shutting his eyes and everything, but a familiar, restless energy snapped them right open. So, breakfast. Izuku's forage into the marshy reeds yielded a handful of pale blue eggs, and he'd found lashings of bacon in the hull of the boat yesterday, nestled carefully in a wonderful box that seemed to keep things cool as if by magic. Aizawa had also left them a number of cast iron pans and one battered old kettle. Izuku nodded to himself. This would do nicely. Katsuki woke up to a plate of food under his nose. Izuku watched fondly as he scrunched his face and scraped a hand through his hair, squinting in the sunlight. "Huh," he said, voice raspy, "you cooked?" He sounded pleased. "Yeah." Izuku set the plate on his stomach. "I was up, I thought I might. It won't be as good as yours, though." Katsuki deposited a forkful of eggs into his mouth, mid-yawn. And then another. Izuku watched him take a few more bites before Katsuki's face had settled back into its characteristic scowl. "Can I effin' help you?" Izuku his head. "No." "Good, another forkful, bacon this time, then stop watching me eat, you demon weirdo." Izuku jolted and set his sights on his own plate, mumbling some vague apology. Katsuki was acting completely and utterly normal, spiky attitude and all. No suspicious. Head touching. No sign of the mysterious aloe vera that had done actual real-life magic to his hair. Izuku concluded that his theories must be correct, and resolved to ask Mina for more information on dragon friendships next time he saw her. Reciprocation was important. Perhaps he should wash Katsuki's hair. It had been so nice under his fingers that time Izuku had managed to cut it, all those months ago. A shiver skated up and down his spine at the memory, the bond thrumming hot with some strange, boiling tension. Goosebumps rose over his forearms. Perhaps not. Izuku finished his breakfast, enjoying the languid pulse of the bond tugging at his fingertips, like a cat eager to play. Katsuki stole 2 of his 3 lashings of bacon. Izuku pretended not to notice. They decided to leave the fire going because although it wasn't windy, the air had a bite that the sparse woods they were nestled in didn't quite ward off. "What are we doing today?" Izuku asked from inside his mug of tea. Katsuki was sneering at him judgmentally, but the pleasing waft of steam over his freezing face outweighed Izuku's care factor. "Studying. We need to pick that 𝗬𝗵𝗲 lullaby to bits." Izuku felt inordinately fluttery about Katsuki's use of we. He nodded vigorously, anticipating a dynamic brainstorm session, complete with much well-rounded discussion. Across a stretch of sea, a semi-spotted squirrel serpent watched as an envelope closed with a pout. She stomped around for a moment, face twisted, blonde hair bobbing, saying words that the squirrel serpent couldn't understand. She lifted his leg and roughly fastened the letter to it with a bit of twine. She said more words, loud and screeching, and then pointed 2 fingers northwest. The squirrel serpent had never needed to fly in that direction before, but he knew where to go. And he knew better than to disobey. Carefully, he hopped atop a shelf and wriggled up a chimney only a few bricks wide that emerged from the top of the great castle that was his home, and into the frigid air. It was raining. The squirrel serpent tucked his legs under himself and did his best to protect the envelope from the droplets, flapping determinedly northwest. Katsuki, apparently, intended for the 2 of them to brainstorm in silence, and had told Izuku so in no uncertain terms after his first question. Izuku tried to acquiesce, he really did, but even mumbling quietly to himself earned him painful ear pullings and cheek pinches. He would have found some other patch of island to settle down on, but Katsuki kept jabbing fingers at lines in their discovered lullaby and demanding Izuku repeat them out loud. He had also found Grandma Chiyo's stash of writing materials and was making fabulous use of them. Izuku watched in fascination and poorly disguised envy as Katsuki penned in line after line of symbols that looked like long, curly caterpillars, if each caterpillar had a baker's dozen worth of elbows. "What are you writing about?" Izuku blurted out, when Katsuki made a particularly complicated shape and enclosed it in a vicious circle. Katsuki shot him a withering look, which was entirely unwarranted. It wasn't Izuku's fault that the strange magic, maybe, that allowed him to understand Dragonese as it was spoken hadn't extended itself to the written word. "The lost things? Have you made any progress?" Katsuki looked like he was weighing the pros and cons of tipping the ink pot over Izuku's head. "Yes. Right." Izuku fiddled with his fingers. "Progress with what specifically?" Katsuki buried his face in his hands and groaned. "I'm not gonna get you to shut up, am I?" Izuku avoided eye contact in lieu of an answer, which was answer enough. "Thought so." Katsuki let his hands drop. "Right, listen close, 'cause I ain't repeating myself." He tapped the feather end of his quill against his notebook, starting with the dragon jewel. "Why?" "'Cause I said so." Mouth closed, dead. "Anyway, the dragon jewel, I'm pretty sure I've heard of it before." "From where?" Izuku interrupted, half just to piss Katsuki off. Katsuki glared at him. "I don't know, but if you'd listened, you impatient shithead, I would have gotten to the part where I say, but I know someone we can ask about it. Some sparkly F. He's obsessed with crystals and rocks and—" Izuku couldn't help the way his something squeezed inside his ribcage. Gosh, Katsuki had so many people, didn't he? Useful, dragon people, who he'd known for ages, probably. Izuku cleared his throat. "Cool. Cool. Awesome. Where does he live? Can we visit him today?" Katsuki scoffed. "Unless you want to be AF in Marshmallow, we aren't going near him for at least a week. He flies off to God knows where during the full moon. Anyone who comes close gets blasted, and you're flammable." Izuku frowned. "What's a marshmallow?" Katsuki raised his eyes in disbelief. "How you beard-brained shitheads have managed to take over the entire goddamn archipelago is actually f***ing beyond me. You're telling me Vikings figured out motherfucking compasses, but you haven't mixed sugar and gelatin together. Kaken, you don't even like sugar." Katsuki leveled a finger at him. "Everyone likes marshmallows." Izuku eyed him dubiously, picturing a thick, chunky, sugary stew the color of, well, a marsh. Not exactly appetizing. "We'll see about that." "Dumps." Katsuki stole the stick from his hand and smacked it out against the earth. "Don't argue with me. You'll always be wrong, eyes on the page, 𝗵𝗃. God, if I could read this I swear I'd chuck you in the ocean." Izuku sighed dramatically and set his chin in his hand. "What your friend's doing anyway? What's so special about a full moon?" "Not my friend, and you can ask him yourself. You couldn't pay me to repeat the HT that comes out of his pointy f***ing mouth." "Pointy. Pointy." Katsuki looked perturbed at the mere memory of it. Izuku hid a smile in his palm. "Okay, so that's the dragon jewel. What about the crown?" "Within a mountain's secret keep." "I'm pretty sure that would mean it's under a mountain." I wrote a list of all the ones in the archipelago. Izuku grinned. Of course he had. "That's amazing, Kaken. And we can check each one for cave systems, or underground lakes and stuff. I can't wait to see them. I wonder if they're different to the caves on 𝗵𝘃𝗃. Those had all these pointy things everywhere, like columns. It was so cool." Katsuki clicked his teeth and scribbled something down. "Should have known you'd be gung f in ho about it. You're such a weirdo, you know. Who the f gets excited about caves?" "Spelunking is a very exciting activity." "Listen to the sentence you just said." Izuku still didn't see the issue. Katsuki's sigh shook the clouds. Fine, get excited about that SHT in your own time," and he turned over to a new page. "Tell me about that sword. You said you knew something yesterday." His pen was poised over the paper, as if waiting for Izuku to speak. But I thought we were working from the bottom up. That's not the next one in order. Who says it isn't? I make the order around here, dipshit. Your order's stupid. You're the only stupid thing around here, stupid. That was a really stupid sentence, actually. Stop saying stupid. You were the one that started repeating it. If you don't tell me about that sword right now, Katsuki said through gritted teeth, I'm going to feed this feather through your mouth and pull it out one of your nostrils. Then we'd see what's really stupid around here, got it? Izuku gulped. Right. Got it. The sword. Why yes. Well, I might be wrong, he began haltingly, eyes on that pen, but there are all these carvings and pictures of heroes everywhere on 𝗏𝗃, not just on 𝗏𝗃 probably, but like on our shields and weapons and on the walls and stuff, and when I started working in the forge I realized that all the swords the heroes were carrying were exactly the same one, always with this long lightning stripe on it. I was curious, so I asked my dad, I didn't ask for your whole effing life story, Deku. Do you know about the sword or not? Izuku wrinkled his nose at him. If you'd listened, he said, parroting what Katsuki had told him earlier just to see his mouth twist into a pout, it's called the Storm Blade, after Thor's lightning bolt. If this Yoichi person had a favorite sword, wouldn't it be the one that all the heroes held? I don't know. Just a thought. So that's that, then? Well, no, Izuku frowned at the page. The thing that's confusing me is this other line here, the baleful edge to slay his pride. Wouldn't such a legendary sword, like, increase your pride or something, not slay it, right? It's probably just really effing hard to get. Crushes a bunch of wimpy Viking egos to dust when they fail, or whatever. Maybe. But then why have I never heard the bard sing about it? Or anyone other than All Might even mention it? Vikings love perilous adventure stories. Katsuki had his thinking face on. The one with the furrowed brow. What is it? Izuku asked. Maybe they do sing about it. You got any stories about buried treasure? Heaps. Blue Blade's bounty, Ironhook's vault, the jewels guarded by the Lady of the Bay of the Broken Heart. There's even supposed to be one on 𝗏𝗃, but no one's ever found it. The curse of Grim-Beard the Ghastly. Katsuki snorted. Sounds like a friendly bloke. Oh yeah, really upstanding sort of guy, Izuku grinned. He'd have fun with my mother. Izuku smacked him with the book. What have they got to do with the sword? Legendary, mythical sword sounds like a pretty valuable effing asset. If I were a effing pirate king or whatever I wouldn't leave that 𝗧𝗏𝗃 lying in field. What? You think the sword is buried with other treasure? Like the ones from the songs? Katsuki shrugged. I dunno. You're the one who said it's next to all your 𝗬𝗏𝗄 heroes. Izuku remembered the lean line of the lightning bolt carved onto the walls of the great hall, the firelight drawing its shadow along the ground. He could picture Katsuki holding it high above his head, letting the bitingly sharp edge catch the last rays of the dying sun and yelling in triumphant victory. Yeah, I did. All Might cleared his throat, and the clamor of the gathered Vikings settled into silence. Thank you, All Might said gravely, for meeting with me on such short notice. As many of you already know, my son is missing. Judging by the state of his cell, and the 2 guards we found knocked out outside, it is safe to say that he has been kidnapped. A murmur rippled through the hall. Obviously, this is a very serious situation we find ourselves in, All Might continued, one that calls for immediate action. Why should we care? Someone shouted from the crowd, a particularly nasty man whose body was so thick and bulging that he'd been nicknamed muscular. The twerp's already been exiled. He ain't a part of this tribe no longer. A few of his lackeys yelled their agreement, thumping meaty fists against their shields. Silence. All Might bellowed, Are you the chief? Are you muscular? Call off your dogs or I will. Sheepishly, the men put away their shields. Thank you, All Might nodded. As I was saying, we must take immediate action. Although Izuku, technically had been exiled at the time of his kidnapping, he had not yet left the safety of 𝗏𝗃, so any attack on him can be considered a threat to us. Oh, and I hereby revoke his exile. Anyone who wants to argue can fight me in hand-to-hand combat on this very stage, beneath the eye of Thor the Thunderer. The large wooden carving of Thor set into the wall behind All Might's head looked on solemnly. No one argued. Right? All Might said, I need a search party to take the west, another to take the south, I'll be taking the east and yes, what is it Chiyo? 𝗵𝗃 lowered her withered hand. I am of the opinion that we should wait for Izuku to return of his own volition. I have looked into the future, and I must warn you, All Might, this is a very bad idea. Besides, this search party nonsense is a colossal waste of time, as someone who doesn't want to be found often isn't. All Might thumbed his temples. This woman. Chiyo, he said, I am sure I speak for the whole tribe when I say your healing and, other talents are invaluable to us all. This, however, is a matter of politics. Of course, All Might, Chiyo said, serenely, but don't be so hasty with your conclusions. Why, I remember when you were a young boy you ran away quite once a month. And your father didn't even have to exile you. She gave him a sharp look. Well, yes, All Might said uncomfortably, but this is different. The cell door was completely melted off, Chiyo. How do you suppose Izuku managed to do that all on his own? A strong burning rune should suffice. All Might drew himself up to his full height. As I have told you time and time again, he boomed, there is no such thing as magic. I won't have it spoken. He turned to the waiting masses, I am the chief of this tribe, and I say that my son Izuku has been kidnapped by a hostile Viking tribe, and we should consider this an act of war. Half the men will accompany me on these search parties, and the rest of you will stay and defend the village, and that is final. The Vikings shouted their agreement, feet stamping, and 𝗵𝗃 slunk out of the hall, shaking her head. Outside, Aizawa was leant against a pillar, waiting. How did it go? 𝗵𝗃 heaved a great sigh. About as well as I expected, and she looked out onto the distant horizon shrouded in gray clouds. I hope those boys are moving quickly, she murmured, for all our sakes. You know, we have something called Devil's Gates on our map, ancient F-ins thing. Izuku stretched his arms over his head, feeling his spine pop. Really? Yeah, Katsuki said, eyes fastened to the hem of Izuku's tunic. For some reason, it's, this dumb volcano. On an island. Is it active? Izuku yawned. What? Is it active? Izuku repeated, dropping his arms. Katsuki's head snapped away. Yeah. And it's west of here. Way west. There weren't many active volcanoes in the archipelago. Izuku bet the Vikings had their own name for it. So the ruby stone must be there, then, right? That's easy. But I wonder what Lover's Fall means. Maybe it's the name of a landmark there or something. Who knows? Ah well. Izuku drew a shaky little mountain next to the intelligible paragraph in Katsuki's notebook with a little river of lava pouring down the side. I suppose we'll find out soon enough. At any rate, I'm glad we've got a location for this one. I mean, look at the arrow bit, what even are lands of sun and myth. It rains nearly all year round out here, and when it isn't raining it's snowing. Obviously it's outside the archipelago, then, idiot. Izuku felt his brow crinkle in confusion. But there's nothing but Rome outside the archipelago. And whatever's at the end of the mainland. You're telling me you have never sailed further than that? Kaken, the earth is as flat as a pancake. Sail too far one way and you'll fall off the end of it. Katsuki paused. You're joking? Why would I be joking? Nah, that's f***ing mental. None of you. Well, the Hysterics tribe to the west claims they made it to America, but everyone knows they're mad. America's imaginary. Katsuki rubbed his fingers into his temples. I can't do this. I can't effing do this. First marshmallows and now this. And I can't even blame you for your stupidity. It's inherited. Flat. And the sun just rises to check on you personally, does it? The goddess soul takes care of the sun. Katsuki threw his hands up. Oh, of course, 'cause that makes perfect sense. Does she sing the 𝗧𝗵𝗃 Vikings lullabies at sunset too? I don't suppose you have a better explanation for it, Izuku grumbled, crossing his arms. Katsuki just shook his head. I can't wait till you learn about science. It's gonna blow your tiny effin' mind. Izuku stuck his tongue out at him. Know-it-all. Dimwit. Buzzkill. Professional dimwit. Meanie. Half-pint. Flying frog. Landlocked little butt. They looked at each other for a second, and then another, and then they burst out laughing. If you call me a flying frog again, I'm going to effing eat you, 𝗧𝗍𝗃 threatened, muffling his raspy sniggers in the sleeve of his tunic. I thought you said you don't eat humans, Izuku choked out. I don't, 𝗧𝗍𝗃 replied, shoving Izuku headfirst into the shrubbery, especially not nasty burnt broccoli FRs like you. Yeah, stop whining, those ferns are your people, you know. And then they were both laughing so hard they couldn't say anything else. An unassuming guard dragon, tasked with keeping an eye on the little Isle of 𝗵𝘃𝗲, absently flicked the dirt out of her talons. She'd had nothing to do for months. The tribe of the hopeless hobbits, or whatever they called themselves, had to be the most unremarkable band of idiots in the entire Inner Isles. Just her luck, really, that she'd get tasked with the catapult launching, flea-picking apes and not, say, the 𝗵𝘃𝗲𝗄, who had so many sheep that they wouldn't even notice her nicking one or two here and there. They also had much better personal hygiene, which would have been far easier on her sensitive, aristocratic nose. She was just about to settle down for a nap when a wink of movement at the island's docks caught her eye. She flapped over to have a look. The commotion seemed to be a sizable number of burly soldiers boarding 4 separate longboats, fit with enough supplies to last them at least a week out on the water. She wrinkled her elegant brow. That was strange. There had been none of the usual preparation that normally preceded one of these longer voyages over the past couple of days, no village-wide celebration, no evening sacrifices to their ugly gods, no sail mending or stockpiling or anything of the sort. How curious! She swooped low and close, determined to catch the echoes of the Vikings' conversations. Now, she was a very well-trained guard dragon, but a guard dragon assigned to a backwater island out in the sticks that rained like it was going out of fashion only really needed a couple of words of Norse to get by. She only understood snatches of what the baboons in Brigandine were saying, but it was enough for her hackles to rise. Search. Lost? Oh no. Oh dear. This kind of thing was exactly that the guard dragons had been instructed to look out for. Warn your ruling monarch if your Viking tribe is ever suddenly determined to find something lost in the archipelago. She swooped in once more, just to make sure. Yes, there it was again, lost. Heart the guard dragon turned tail northwest and began determinedly flying home. She had some news to deliver. And what the F is a ticking thing? A ticking thing. Really? We got a 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗄 of alliteration over here. Speak in goddamn tongues for the rest of the lullaby, but sure, throw in ticking thing. Not like some people need to know what the DMN thing is. Izuku, still giggling slightly from being smushed into the dirt, rolled around to face him. Ticks you off a bit, Kaken? 𝗧𝗍𝗃 glared down at him, murder in his eyes. It just made Izuku laugh harder. What? A name? He paused for breath, voice trembling. A name like that doesn't tickle your fancy? 𝗧𝗍𝗃's face contorted. He looked like an angry troll. Izuku clutched his sides. I guess it's for particular tastes, Izuku gasped out, or maybe it's a diversion tactic. If you say tick one more time, what? You'll, Izuku gulped, tick me the middle finger. Izuku screamed with laughter as 𝗧𝗍𝗃 shoved his head into the dirt again, but Izuku could have sworn he'd caught the corner of 𝗧𝗍𝗃's mouth ticking upwards as he turned back towards the book. Shithead. Get up. Come see if I remember this right. It sounds effin' fake. A key that opens 𝗧𝗏𝗏, is that what it says? No way that's real. Izuku collected himself and joined 𝗧𝗍𝗃's side once more. Yeah, that's right. Maybe it's a metaphor for freedom, or something. Or possibilities. Doors opening and stuff like that. 𝗧𝗍𝗃 noted it down in the page margin. That's what I thought. Cryptic mothaf, this yoichi. You two would probably get along. Izuku flicked a clod of dirt at his head. It bounced away harmlessly. Haha, hilarious. What's next? The cursed throne, on which he will not sit alone. Fun. You know any cursed thrones? Nope, Izuku answered, popping the 𝗃𝗃. The only throne I've ever seen is All Might's, and someone turned all the grape carvings on it into melons. So, probably not that one. 𝗧𝗍𝗃 sniggered. Izuku rolled his eyes. Real mature, Kaken. He peered at the lullaby again, fingers fiddling with his bottom lip. Okay, so that's 9, he muttered. We must be missing here, a dragon's heart in gentle hands. Oh dear, Kaken. Do you think, does that mean we have to get a real one? Don't be squeamish. There are dead dragons all over the place. We find one, we take out their heart. Done. Izuku shivered. That seems so wrong. Not as wrong as having a wall mounted with their heads, Katsuki said mildly. You've stared at that key your whole life. This should be nothing. Izuku winced, stomach tense with guilt. Katsuki searched his face for a moment, then sighed. Listen, those wild dragons and those Nomo, they really are animals, alright. Doesn't make it better. But they are. Izuku bit his lip against the urge to argue. The bond thrummed warm between them, draping across Izuku's shoulders like a comforting arm. He leaned into it. Thanks, Kaken. Katsuki cleared his throat. Yeah, you're effing welcome or whatever. Izuku stared at him in surprise. That was so nice, he breathed. Red crept up Katsuki's ears, vivid under the blonde hair. F off, shithead. I ain't nice. But that was almost polite. Are you sick? No. Are you sure? Izuku reached forward to check Katsuki's forehead, and he battered his hands out of the way. Get the F off me. Die. Hours later, once they'd eaten lunch and gone round and round in circles thoroughly dissecting each line of the lullaby, and not getting very far at all, Katsuki snapped the book shut. This theoretical bullshit isn't getting us anywhere. We should go get the shield. Izuku nearly cracked his neck. Whipping his head around to stare. What now? Katsuki shrugged. Why not? You said it yourself. There are Roman ships crawling all over the borders of the archipelago, goddamn vultures. He stood up and shucked off his socks. Izuku followed him towards the water lapping at their island's closest shore. But we don't even know if these things are real yet. What's the point of wasting our time? We should be sure first. Privately though, he felt his blood sing at the promise of another quest. The quest with Katsuki. Katsuki smirked at him, wading into the ocean. I felt that. It's freezing. Does the water ever get warm in the shithole, or do you just risk losing your ball year-round? Izuku wasn't quite sure if that was a rhetorical question or not, but he answered anyway. It's really only warm in the summer current, but you can't swim there. Why the F not? Sharkworms, Izuku replied, joining Katsuki in the water. It really was cold. Big, black, aquatic bloodhounds, jagged dorsal fins, like 50 rows of teeth. Horrible alligator legs that allow them to climb onto shallow boats. They're one of the only dragons we actually have a name for because they've killed so many fishermen. Katsuki grinned. Sounds fun. Izuku elbowed him in the ribs. Katsuki didn't even flinch. It was nice to sit with him like this. The water was steely gray but wonderfully pellucid, with a clear view to the algae-covered rocks propped up against each other on the seafloor. Tiny brown fish wiggled in and out of the sand, sending up billows of murky clouds behind them. A lone carp languished in a muddy bed of seaweed, drifting back and forth slightly with the current. It reminded Izuku of days in their basin, made him ache strangely, right under his breastbone, at the tether end of the bond. And then Katsuki smacked his knee, disturbing the peace. Come on, he said, we'll leave at sunset. The heirs won't see us coming under the cover of dark. There wasn't room to argue. Izuku didn't mind. By air or boat? Obviously boat, you idiot. You think the Romans aren't gonna notice a great big dragon landing on their deck? I was just checking, Izuku grumbled. You have some weird ideas sometimes, Kaken. Say that to my face, seaweed. Like blondes any better. You look like a daffodil. Katsuki swiveled around, expression of pure, unadulterated rage. Izuku fled as fast as he could, but there was only so far he could run on an island the size of Thor's XL dinner plate. This was not the darkest place in the archipelago. But to a small deadly gnattor that was crying for its mother, it might as well have been. It had wandered away from its home in the cozy thickets, into a curious-looking cave, and down, 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 frantically turning wrong turn after wrong turn until the air was cold and stale, and reeked of metal and mildew. Some unfortunate twist of fate led the gnattor into a particularly large cavern, that happened to be inhabited by a huge creature who was guarding something precious. This was a far larger and scarier killing machine than a mere sharkworm. It was ancient and bitter, and worst of all, permanently hungry. The little gnattor cried for its mother again, and hopped a bit farther forward. A singularly unattractive sludgy tentacle curled its way around the small dragon and lifted it into the air. The creature did something to the natter to kill it, something most unpleasant, and the poor little animal let out a last shriek of absolute terror, and then all was silent. Izuku and Katsuki's little boat floated through that same gentle sea they'd stayed in the night before last, only now a thick layer of fog had swallowed up the peaceable country to the north and the Isle of Berk to the west. Indeed, it had swallowed up so much of everything that it was as if the 𝗵𝗃𝗲 was a skyboat and had left the earth entirely to sail in cloud banks way up in the air. "You reckon there are sharkworms around?" Katsuki whispered to Izuku. There was no need to be quiet, not really, but Izuku was glad he was, anyway. He trailed a finger through the water. "Freezing." "No," he whispered back, "I think we're okay." But something was still making the back of his neck prickle, and he snatched his finger out of the water as quickly as he dunked it. Just to be safe. Katsuki looked weird in the fog. The gray clung to his hair and skin but seemed to dissipate away from his eyes when Izuku tilted his head just so. Izuku wanted to reach out and touch him, just to make sure he was still tangible. A brisk wind filled out the sail. They weren't moving in any particular direction, besides forward, waiting to happen upon a Roman ship that might not even be out here. Izuku strained his ears, desperate to hear something, anything at all, only to meet empty, muffled silence. There was nothing to do besides whisper to each other and watch the fog slowly blush pink, then purple, as the sun set in the distant sky above them. Droplets condensed on Izuku's helmet. And maybe it was his paranoia, but he could have sworn he saw dark shapes moving in the water around them, just glimpses that looked frighteningly similar to jagged dorsal fins. Without light, Izuku's sundial was useless. He had no way to check how many hours passed in the frigid night. He and Katsuki shared some dried fruit, a hunk of cheese, and some fish they'd kept from lunch. Not much, but Izuku was too nervous to eat anymore. More silence. Izuku's fingers went purple, a step or two under frostbite. He sandwiched them under his armpits. Thicker, colder silence, intercut by the slosh of waves. "And then there," Katsuki said, pointing west, "a boat. It's huge." Izuku squinted. Katsuki was right. Rising from the fog was the broad side of a ship, undoubtedly Roman, the top deck meters above them and well lit with torches. "Hell yeah," Katsuki whispered, as Izuku smoothly drifted them parallel. "Let's get this in shield." Izuku tossed a grappling hook attached to a sturdy bit of rope, thanks Aizawa, over the rim of the ship. It caught and held. Izuku said a quick prayer to Odin, tied the other to the mast of the 𝗵𝗃𝗲, and shimmied quietly up its length, trying his best not to stick his boot into Katsuki's face, who was following close behind. Carefully, they clambered over the side. At one end of the ship was a huge white tent. At the other, the prow. In the middle of the deck, around a fire blazing in a metal pit, were 250 of Rome's finest soldiers, heavily armed with the latest in modern weaponry, in the middle of singing a sea shanty. Izuku let out a breath of relief. "Look," Katsuki murmured, right in his ear, and although Izuku nearly rattled out of his skin, he did look. Less than a meter away from them was a battered Roman shield, with the eagle insignia and everything, slumped on a barrel. Ordinary. Boring. The strings under Izuku's skin recoiled in disgust. "Let's grab it and get out of here," Katsuki hissed, but Izuku shook his head. "It's not the right one." Katsuki looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "The F do you mean, not the right one?" Izuku shook his head again. He didn't know, only there was that thrumming under his skin again, the one that had reeled him all the way across the Isle of Berk all the months ago, right to Katsuki's side, armed with bandages and grim determination. Katsuki scrutinized him, then huffed a long exhale through his nostrils, conceding. "Fine. We'll look around. Stay low, for F's sake. I'm not scraping your splattered brains off this deck." "Got it." Izuku winced at the imagery, but flattened himself to the side of the barrel. Slow, slinking, almost like he'd shifted into his dragon form, Katsuki poured himself into the divot behind the lifeboats, and then again behind the weapons rack, gesturing for Izuku to follow. He did, with far less grace and far more noise than 𝗧𝗃𝗃. They covered meters of the deck like that, 𝗧𝗃𝗃 a creature of shadow and sharp eyes, and Izuku trailing behind, heart thumping meanly in his throat. In the center of the deck, the Romans were their feet to a different song. Faster! Izuku could just make out the Latin, something about mermaids dragging doe-eyed men to their deaths. He shivered, then jumped as 𝗧𝗃𝗃 slapped a hand to his Izuku snuck a glance. His face was pale, even in the darkness, lips bloodless. "Izuku," he croaked, and Izuku went cold. "What is that?" Izuku followed his eyes to a dark box, maybe the size of several large cottages, shoved up the starboard side of the ship like an afterthought. No, not a box, Izuku realized, squinting, a cage, full to bursting with a slow-moving mass. Izuku couldn't make out much, a ripple here, a glint there, until a soldier in the middle of the deck accidentally dropped a torch into a vat of wine and set it ablaze, splashing light across it. Izuku's hands flew to his mouth. Dragons! Hundreds upon hundreds of them, all different sizes and species, snarled together in scaly knots, yellow eyes snapping, wings beating uselessly at the lattice of metal, iron, keeping them in. Izuku's stomach roiled. What are they? Izuku didn't know what he was trying to ask. The flickering light caught the bob of 𝗧𝗃𝗃's throat as he swallowed. "Come on," he said hoarsely, turning his head even as his eyes clung to the sight. "We gotta get that shield. We've got to free them." Izuku's words were sharp and high. "We can't leave them here like this." "Yes we can," 𝗧𝗃𝗃 snarled, and Izuku saw the anger, the horror, sizzling under his skin, felt it arcing through the bond. "We have a job to do, Deku. If we get caught we'll end up in that cage too, or worse. Use your head." But Izuku set his jaw. 𝗧𝗃𝗃's scowl froze. "Deku! Don't even, too late." Izuku darted out of 𝗧𝗃𝗃's reach and straight towards the hulking cage, swifter and more agile than he'd been all night. "No." 𝗧𝗃𝗃 whisper roared behind him. "Deku, they might be feral. They'll effing eat you." Izuku didn't care. But 𝗧𝗃𝗃 did. A hand clamped on the collar of his shirt, on some of his hair too, and yanked, clattering Izuku into a pile of noisy wooden crates. The music quietened. They caved like a house of cards. 𝗧𝗃𝗃 swore, and heaved them behind the pile. "Why'd you stop me?" Izuku exclaimed hotly as 𝗧𝗃𝗃 peered out of their hiding place. "Shoots, someone's coming." Izuku's voice died in his mouth. Heavy footfalls, the clink of metal, the bulky vowels of spoken Latin hitting the air. "Who's there? Did you hear something?" "Hiss. Something's here. Check the cage locks." The two of them inched backwards on their knees. Izuku was holding his breath. He was pretty sure 𝗧𝗃𝗃 was too. Further and further, until it seemed like there was nowhere left to go, the white tent at their backs, the murmuring Romans in the front. 𝗧𝗃𝗃's hand clamped down on Izuku's and squeezed desperately. Izuku's pulse bounced. "Hey," he said, tendons in his neck jumping. "Listen, But Izuku's gaze snagged on something beside them. "Kakin," he said, wildly, "don't make a sound, oh." And then Izuku snuck one arm under the bend of 𝗧𝗃𝗃's legs and the other around his back and heaved, gods, he was heavy, onto shaking feet. "Deku?" 𝗧𝗃𝗃 gasped out, but before the Romans could make them out amongst the shadows, Izuku wobbled them through a slit in the dimly lit tent and towards a truly gigantic urn that Izuku prayed to Thor was empty. To us. Izuku dropped 𝗧𝗃𝗃 unceremoniously onto the clay bottom and climbed in after him. 𝗧𝗃𝗃 was still spluttering as Izuku pressed his eye to a spiderweb crack in the side of their impromptu hiding place and scanned the dark room. There was a man on one of the low, U-shaped couches. Izuku hadn't even seen him as they'd come in, too occupied with the pursuing soldiers, and was just about to panic when the man's body rose and fell with a low, rumbling snore. Phew. He was just about to maneuver around to tell 𝗧𝗃𝗃 when two tall, well-dressed soldiers thundered through the doorway flap, swords drawn. The man startled awake. 𝗧𝗃𝗃 stiffened, the tops of his cheeks gleaming with reflected light. "Consul," one of the soldiers, "sorry to wake you. Has there been an intruder in here? Any suspicious characters?" Izuku watched from his peephole as other people trickled into the tent. More soldiers, the man who had been playing the lyre, a short fellow in a stained apron, a few young-looking servants in white drapes. The consul flicked his hand at one of them, and the boy bowed and scuttled off. An intruder, the consul yawned, sitting up. Now that Izuku could see him properly, the consul was a distinctly unpleasant-looking man. Hugely round and droopy, like a walrus, and covered in a bubbling rash that he scratched at with fat fingers. Yes, one of the soldiers approached, the taller of the two, bowed and revealed Izuku's helmet. We've located some sort of raft tethered to the ship. We've secured it to the stern for now and await further orders. On one hand, Izuku seethed. The hopeful Puffin was an excellent boat. Who were these snobs anyway? On the other hand, he'd never felt so grateful to be able to Grandma Chio for teaching him Latin. He looked over to see Katsuki pressed to an eye hole too, mouth curled. A barbarian, the consul mused, taking the helmet, a teeny, weeny barbarian by the looks of it. It won't be an issue, drawled the tall soldier. Rome is apt at squashing mosquitoes after all. Marvelous, chortled the consul, fingers fumbling around in the bowl the returning servant had placed on a low table in front of him and stuffing the contents in his mouth. Sit with me, prefect, help yourself, and then, to the other soldiers, you heard him, search the ship. The tall soldier, the prefect, settled on one of the other long couches and steepled his fingers together. The two of them began to talk about supplies, or something, grain, mead, but Izuku couldn't hear him over the rushing in his ears. The consul was eating nanodragons. Live nanodragons, the size of small locusts, drowning in thick honey that gummed up their wings. Their pathetic, squeaking cries just managed to reach them and echo thinly around the urn. Katsuki's fingernails bit into Izuku's skin. Bile rose in Izuku's throat. The nanodragons, the cage of trapped, terrified dragons they'd left outside, it lit a fire in Izuku that he'd only felt a few times before, on the day he'd decided to keep Katsuki alive, no matter what the cost, yesterday when cold hot white determination had propelled him to swing a book at Toga's head. The longing to save. He scanned the urn, then the curtains above them, looking for something to use. His gaze alighted on a tiny, squirming thing, another nano-dragon, clinging to the scalloped edge of a curtain and glowing faintly. He recognized the species from his time in the forest? Of course he did. Nobody in their right mind would see such a tiny creature produce a truly crippling electric shock. Upon contact with predators and forget it, the consul had nearly finished his bowl. There was only one dragon left, struggling to escape. No one was looking at it. The two men were far too busy talking. I have an idea, Izuku sent through the bond. When I say run, run. Katsuki nodded once. Izuku reached up a hand as slowly as he could and pinched the glowing thing by its horny, non-conductive tail. Tongue poking from the corner of his mouth, peering just over the edge of the pot, Izuku aimed. He'd only get one shot. Just as the consul reached towards for one last morsel, Izuku tossed his unconventional weapon in a perfect arc into the bowl of honey. The consul's fingers closed around its tiny stomach, and every walrus-y inch of him soared quite 1 meter into the air. His hair stuck up and out like a hedgehog, sparks flew out of his ears and his great blubbering mounds of flesh lit up with a strange blue light and quivered and shivered and wobbled and jiggled hysterically, and as he screamed in petrified confusion, Izuku whispered to Katsuki, "Run." The two of them burst from the urn. The prefect was so dumbfounded by his convulsing consul that it took him a few precious seconds to screech for reinforcements, just enough time for Izuku to grab the remaining nanodragon by its sticky, honey-covered leg, stuff it in a tunic pocket, and dart out of the tent and away towards the cage of dragons not even 4 strides away. The locking mechanism was a simple lift latch, probably designed so that these vile Romans could easily stuff their new captures in with their winged companions. As it was, it took Izuku about 2 seconds to figure out, and then the air was full of with furious dragons gnashing teeth and spurting fire and pouring over the Romans like a river of karma. Izuku grinned. Katsuki appeared at his side, face alight with disbelief and something that looked like wondrous pride. "You crazy 𝗵𝗃, let's get out of here, come on," and he began to pull Izuku around the back of the cage and away from the enraged reptiles absolutely ravaging the Romans. Then, a flash. A tug, strings under Izuku's skin. A voice in his ear, around him, inside him, singing look, look, look. Izuku looked. There, in the console's large, purpling hand, was their shield. Beautifully engraved. And on the knob in the middle, the carved face of a woman, hair a writhing nest of snakes, metal eyes like lances, serpent's eyes, mouth open in a silent scream. "Kaken," Izuku said, and his own voice sounded calm and level and impossibly far away. "That's it?" Katsuki looked over his shoulder. "You sure?" "Of course you are. You and your If in secret library passages, goddamn. You gotta get it, sorry. I'll raise hell. You've got about 5 minutes. Izuku nodded. Katsuki drew his sword, where on earth had been hiding it, grin glinting. He squeezed Izuku's arm. "Meet you at the boat?" And then marched right into the fray. Izuku did not waste the time he had been given. He sprinted towards that winking shield, sticking to the shadows, ducking under swiping talons and wayward tails, dragging a heavy stone net he'd found stuck under a barrel along with him. It was probably used to catch dragons only this morning. With a surge of strength he didn't know he had, Izuku flung it open and out like a sheet onto the cowering body of the dragon-eating console, pinning him crudely to his own polished deck. Isn't fate artistic? Izuku leaned over him and inspected the ◧ strap of the shield buckled to the console's trembling arm. "Give me the shield," he said in perfect Latin. The console gawked like a mackerel. The teeny-tiny barbarian, he croaked throatily, neck craning, probably looking for soldiers to come to his aid. None were forthcoming. Whatever Katsuki was doing on the other side of the boat had them thoroughly occupied. But how? Izuku, already tired of his blithering, began to tug at the strap himself, and when that didn't work, saw away at it with the dagger at his hip. Honey still gleamed around the console's quivering lips. Izuku was struck with a surge of inspiration. "Actually, you know what? He racked his brains, thinking back to those lessons with Grandma Chiyo, Jupiter, and I've come for revenge. This is one of my earthly forms." Predictably, the console quailed. "No. Yes," Izuku said, sage as could be, "your crimes are unforgivable, I'm afraid. Have mercy." "All right," Izuku said agreeably, "but you have to leave this place. And never catch dragons again. And, you must swear to be a strict vegetarian for the rest of your life. Or I'll rain down fire on your voyage." He glanced over his shoulder, where half the ship and most of the masts had already gone up in flames. More fire. And other terrible things. Like much hotter fire. "I swear," blubbed the console, I swear it. Please don't kill me." Izuku finally managed to get the shield free. He slid it out under the net, hands tingling, a cord of history at his back winding out and recoiling with a near-audible snap. "Keep your promises," Izuku murmured absent-mindedly, running a finger over the carved woman who, up close, looked equal parts unimaginably horrifying and achingly sad. And then he set off towards the mayhem the dragons had created. A fleet of Roman soldiers, 200 strong, against one Kaken. You had to feel sorry for them. Once he caught sight of him, Izuku felt his heart skip a beat. Katsuki was grinning, wide and feral, twirling his sword above his head and kicking off soldiers with his feet. In the air around him, dragons of all colors whirled and dipped and thumped their spiny tails against red-plumed helmets. "Deku," he roared, slamming his elbow into a stomach, grabbing a snarling dragon out of thin air and launching at the closest Roman. "Where's the shield?" Izuku hefted the shield onto his arm and above his head. Katsuki's answering laugh was wild, and the bond lit up like summer fireflies. Izuku's stomach swooped, hard and fast. Katsuki looked so. Something seized Izuku's arm, right above the elbow, and yanked. The joint at his shoulder popped, and sparking, shooting pain zipped down to his fingertips. Izuku dropped the shield with a clatter. He whirled to face a Roman soldier brandishing a broadsword nearly as long as he was. Spurred into action, Izuku launched himself just far enough to the left to prevent decapitation, but the soldier changed the trajectory of his swipe and instead caught Izuku's already dislocated arm, flaying the skin from the muscle in a shock of burning, blistering agony. Izuku screamed. The soldier raised his sword to strike again, and was tackled to the deck. 𝗧𝗵𝗃, screaming bloody murder and knocking the poor fellow out with his own helmet. Deku, he kicking the broadsword away. That's a lot of BLD. Okay, we gotta get out of here. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 scooped both him and the shield up like it was nothing, and set Izuku onto unsteady feet. Can you walk? Okay, good, that's good, keep doing that. You might have to swim with that cause the boat's not where we left it, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 said urgently, but Izuku, unable to speak through gritted teeth, dragged him towards the stern where the hopeful puffin bobbed cheerfully below. Izuku nearly wept with relief. She was a sight for sore eyes. We have to jump. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 looked determined, swinging his legs over the wooden lip of the ship. Jump. Izuku repeated incredulously. The water below swirled. Blackly. It's too far down to land on the deck without breaking our effin' legs. On 3 all right? Wait. Turn into a dragon or something. Izuku said shrilly, but 𝗧𝗵𝗃 just shook his head. No time. 1, 2. Izuku jumped. A rush of nothing for long seconds, then a jolt of freezing cold hitting his skin like a slab of rock, the salt stinging viciously over the exposed wound in his arm. Izuku's gasp turned to spluttering as a wave swamped him, then another, until he reached the smooth side of the hopeful puffin and managed to pour himself onto the deck. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 was already there, unraveling the rope that bound them to the Roman vessel. The moment he saw Izuku struggle out of the ocean like a wet spider, he fell to his knees and wrapped both hands around Izuku's injured shoulder, which was beginning to go tingly and numb from the cold and BLD loss. "This'll hurt," he said, and that was the only warning Izuku got before his arm was unceremoniously put back in his socket. Before Izuku could even say thank you, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 was ripping the bottom of his tunic into several strips and began binding the weeping wound on Izuku's upper arm. "It's shallow," he bit out as he worked, "lots of BLD, but you'll live, probably with a nasty effin' scar, though." Izuku, woozy from the pain, could only nod his understanding as 𝗧𝗵𝗃 fastened the whole thing into a sling. How strange it was that history repeated itself so. Only a little less than a year ago, and it was Izuku binding 𝗧𝗵𝗃's wounds. Once he was done, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 helped him up and led him towards the mast. "The moment we're done with this clusterfuck you're teaching me how to work this diamond boat," he muttered, as Izuku steered them away from the burning Roman ship, where shouting soldiers were beginning to launch lifeboats off the far side. Izuku tipped the rudder into the wind, urging the hopeful puffin to sail as fast as she possibly could, aware that once the consul came to his senses, there would almost certainly be a search for the teeny-weeny barbarians following close behind them. Not so far away, where the water was warmer and thicker, something stirred in the primeval brains of a shoal of large, ugly dragons who had been on the hunt for an evening meal. Very little could force them to venture from the gentle flow of their ocean current, base creatures as they were, very little indeed. The smell of BLD, however, awakened something within them, something dark, something old, something deadly. It was only a flash of scent, only the faintest whisper. Perhaps a large salmon had grazed itself on the reef. Perhaps a lionfish nearby had found a school of groupers and was feasting messily in a sandbank. Perhaps it was not a living creature at all. Perhaps a sea vent had spewed a particularly metallic plume of hot water and tricked the dragon's sensitive noses. Or perhaps a boy nearby had fallen into the ocean. Just for a second, just long enough for his wound to leach a taste of boiling BLD into the waves. The dragons paused, muscular legs churning, filthy teeth bared in the salty darkness. Then, like an unholy army of black shadows and gleaming scales and dead, beady eyes, they nosed their great bodies in the direction of the trailing scent and shot off towards it in a surge of froth and fins and fear. Invisible. Silent. A line of perfect predators, only visible by their jagged fins slicing through the sea above. Locked on a scent, and starving for it. "We effin' did it." 𝗧𝗵𝗃's mouth was a sneering slash across his face, tilted up with savage joy. "We showed those ugly effin' Romans, some of 'em ding near their hell yeah. Did you see me fight?" Izuku was shuddering with adrenaline and the chill of his sopping clothes, so his answering grin chittered and chattered in his mouth. "I did, why you we are amazing." The bond between them beamed golden with pride, and 𝗧𝗵𝗃 said, "Let's get you dry." Idiot. Izuku toweled himself off as steadily as he could on the rocking boat, still surging towards 𝗏𝗏 as the wind made fat their sails and the 𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗏's mast creaked. He and Katsuki argued for 5 long minutes as he tried, and failed, to stuff Izuku into a thick woolen cloak. You're gonna rattle out of your in skin, you stubborn butt. Come here. Kaken no it's itchy, as the blazing light from the sinking Roman ship grew smaller and smaller until the fog snuffed it out entirely. By all accounts, they were safe. So why did Izuku feel an uneasy prickly at the back of his neck, one that made him want to pop his collar just to hide it? Why did the pressing fog make him nervous, a jittery tingle all the way down to his damp boots? Katsuki didn't seem to notice. He was grudgingly admiring the shield and snapping at Izuku to keep his arms still as they sailed further and further into the dark blue wash of the deep night. Look at these f***ing snakes, what a crazy-looking beach. Why'd you think they made it like that, huh? She one of their gods or something? Izuku shook the feeling off and settled down next to him. I don't know, he said carefully, looking at the woman staring gravely out at from her prison of metal. She looks weird, said. Her engraved face was appealing, but something about her eyes swallowed the rest of it unnervingly. The snakes around her head had their little mouths open, fangs bared and tongues flickering. Katsuki grunted. She looks creepy as 𝗧𝗏 is what it is. I'd put her on my shields too, send my enemies running. Izuku turned away from her swallowing eyes and out onto the black water. Do you know where we are? Katsuki scoffed. No idea. I could fly up and check, but I reckon it'll just look like a fluffy f***ing blanket. The back of Izuku's neck prickled again. He whipped around and squinted at the meager stretch of water not obscured by the drifts. Nothing. But a shadow, right on the edge of where he could see, an oddly shaped wave, maybe. Hey, Kaken, hey, can you look over there really quickly? Do you see anything? Katsuki followed his gaze. Oh, buddy. Izuku was about to shake his head, about to say no, it was probably nothing, when either. A jagged shape in the fog. Are you sure? Yes. They've 6 long, dark ripples, visible even in the black water, curled sinuously under the surface. Slowly, languorously, they began to circle the boat. Cold fear trickled down Izuku's spine. He clutched at his arm. The wound smarted under his fingers. The urgency of the situation dawned on Izuku very quickly. Kaken, he stuttered, voice hushed, we need to get to shore. No. What? Katsuki began to say, and then he must have caught sight of the ripples painting wide circles around them, the peak of jagged fins. Oh, those better not be what I think they are. Izuku could only nod. Katsuki backed away from the handrail. Sharkworms. I thought you said those only swam in warm waters. It's my arm, Izuku replied, inching towards the middle of the boat. And I fell in the water. Once they lock onto a BLD scent, Izuku trailed off. Aizawa had made the same mistake once, back when he'd been a fisherman. A large cut, submerged for too long in open waters. He'd nearly gotten his leg ripped clean from his body, and even though he walked fine now, Izuku knew that it had never really been the same. He didn't even go on fishing trips anymore. And that had only been one sharkworm. Get on my back, Katsuki said suddenly, bring the shield. We'll leave them in the dust, come on. No, Izuku hissed back as the ripples wavered closer. But I'm fast. There's 6 of them. Izuku gently began easing the rudder towards where the fog seemed to be least dense, and they're faster for those first 3 seconds. They'll pounce the moment the boat starts moving too much, surround you, and drag you into the water by your wings. Besides, you're bigger than the boat. Katsuki's jaw tightened. Izuku reached through the bond, but Katsuki abruptly snapped closed on the other side. There's land that way. He yanked the rudder out of Izuku's hand and angled it towards the west. I can smell it. I thought you said these F-airs had legs. They do, but they don't like to go too far inland. Hopefully we can dock and outrun them. They'll lose interest once we're a little out of reach. Probably. That's reassuring. Sensing the slow, careful movement of the 𝗵𝗃𝗃, the shadows dipped out of sight again. Their boat creaked ominously as a swell of wind crested her over rocking waves. That pumping adrenaline that had dipped after they'd left the Roman vessel behind peaked again, filling Izuku with spiraling, vibrating energy. He felt 𝗧𝗖𝗄𝗧 on the other side of their bond, an explosion about to detonate. "Are they gone?" "No," Izuku whispered, lips trembling. "They're preparing to ambush us." He didn't add, but by the look on 𝗧𝗖𝗄𝗧's face, he didn't need to. Somehow, not being able to tell where the creatures were was infinitely more terrifying. Sharkworms were ancient animals, and their brains were formed in who knows what dark and terrible furnace. To them, the hopeful puffin was a large, wounded animal limping through the waters, one that promised 𝗵𝘃𝗍 to be spilled, and guts in the offing and trouble about to happen. Izuku had never felt more like prey in his entire life. Above, way above, the moon bent low. "Shall we give them a hand?" she asked, and swells crashed into cliffsides. "What do you think I've been doing?" the sea said back, and wove a stream of tug and push and pull for the moon to nudge it with one majestic finger. The hopeful puffin veered violently to the left. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 swore, as the rudder was flung out of his hand, a current. "What the f?" Izuku slammed his injured arm into the mast and groaned. 𝗵𝘃𝗍 splattered onto the deck. He and 𝗧𝗵𝗃 made eye contact for a long, quivering moment. Then, the swirling whirlpool movement of the sharkworms tightened around their boat, moving closer and closer and closer, rocking it wildly with the wake of their great, battering tails as they passed. "Oh no," Izuku croaked, white-lipped. "Oh dear. They were not going to make it to shore." 𝗧𝗵𝗃 spat. "That's it, we're flying out of here." Crash. The hopeful puffin rocked crazily from side to side, throwing Izuku and 𝗧𝗵𝗃 to the deck. One sharkworm had bodily slammed into the side of it. Time was up. A plan struck Izuku right between the eyes. A crazy, stupid, reckless plan, 5 times as bad as the disaster they'd left sinking behind them. Almost hysterical with fear, Izuku relayed it to 𝗧𝗵𝗃 through trembling lips. 𝗧𝗵𝗃's eyes were bright. "That's actual in madness." "I know," Izuku, as another sharkworm smacked their prow with a tail and sent them rocking again, "but it's better than nothing." "Is it? Are you going to help or not?" Swearing colorfully, 𝗧𝗵𝗃 flung open the hatch and began emptying waterskins all over the deck. Together, they began shoving everything they owned into the large waterproof sacks. Clothes, pans, Grandma Chiyo's trinkets, coats, coins, not the food, Izuku said quickly. "Just throw that over the side as far as you can." 𝗧𝗵𝗃 hurled the bags of food as hard as he could into the churning sea, only for the sharkworms to rear out of the water and snap them up with their horrible, yellowed, extendable teeth. The sight was so absurdly, ridiculously terrifying that Izuku felt a helpless laugh burble in his throat. For above, they were going to die. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 stripped out of his outer layers and helped Izuku out of his waistcoat and boots, and those went in as well. Before long, they were standing barefoot and shivering as the sharkworms battered the hopeful puffin back and forth with the wakes of their tails, like gigantic cats playing with a juicy mouse. The sound of the wood splintering in the water vibrated beneath their feet. Sweating, shaking with nerves, and barely managing to stay upright on the careening boat, Izuku joined 𝗧𝗵𝗃 in inflating the waterskins until they had several dozen palm-sized bladders of air. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 stuffed a couple of them into each waterproof sack, tied them closed, and then roped them all together into one line. A sharkworm let out a jet of fire that engulfed the mast in flames. "You ready?" Izuku nodded, bags in hand, shield tucked safely under his good arm. "If this works, you're the luckiest Meathead in the world," 𝗧𝗵𝗃 said grimly, and with a yell that shook Thor in his huge, bearskin boots, he swung his sword at the blazing mast. Once, twice Izuku tossed their chain of sacks above the jagged fins. Thankfully, it must have smelled too much like elder and metal and furs, and not enough like food, for it to be worth the sharkworm's time. The slow-trickling river of 𝗵𝘃𝗍 seeping from beneath Izuku's makeshift bandages would have been much more enticing. He watched everything they owned in the world bob away for a second, praying that they would live long enough to retrieve it. The water was beginning to froth as the sharkworms worked themselves into a feeding frenzy, circling ever closer and becoming so aggressive that they began to take bites out of each other, and the smallest of them was torn apart entirely in a bloody bath of flesh and bone and horrible, dark hurry up. 𝗧𝗖𝗍 shouted, hacking away at the mast, and Izuku tore his eyes away from the sight, leaping into the now empty hatch. One more hack at the mast, and 𝗧𝗖𝗍 lowered himself in after. The mast let out a long, low creak. A dying wail. A death rattle. Then, as if in slow motion, it crashed into the swarming, snarling sharkworms, a pillar of heat and wood and light they had never known. For the rest of his life, Izuku would remember the scream those sharkworms screamed that night. Unearthly. Unholy. It made his blood recoil in his veins. With a final sigh, the hopeful puffin flipped onto her stomach and sank beneath the waves, trapping Izuku and 𝗧𝗖𝗍 beneath it. A funeral pyre, for herself. Izuku's first thought was that the plan had failed, and that they were dead meat. The shield tore itself out of his hand with the rush of water and knocked Izuku out of 𝗧𝗖𝗍's grasp. He was turned over and over in somersault after somersault in the freezing water, down, down, down in such a rush that he felt like his head was bursting. His eyelids were fluttering, his breath running out, and a strange, calm sensation of no longer really caring was beginning to come over him, when rough hands grabbed him by the shoulders and dragged him, coughing and spluttering, to the surface of the water and into an air pocket he'd guessed would be trapped beneath the sinking ship. The sharkworms made valiant chase. Izuku could hear their horrible teeth crunching against the hull, but the hopeful puffin was sinking too fast for them to catch up. It was as Izuku predicted, the sharkworms had a certain depth threshold that they wouldn't cross. It was how Aizawa had escaped, all those years ago, swimming down to a rocky outcrop and holding himself there for 10 long minutes, a tourniquet around his bloody leg. Izuku had his eyes squeezed shut, muttering "Thank you, Thor, thank you, Thor," as his ears popped over and over. "I can't believe that worked," 𝗧𝗖𝗍 murmured, several long minutes later, when the boat finally stopped its descent and settled on the ocean floor. Izuku dragged a hand down his face and laughed giddily, heartbeat still frantic. "Me neither. That was brilliant," 𝗧𝗖𝗍 said gruffly, and Izuku blushed. "Where the F are we anyway?" At the bottom of the ocean, Izuku supplied helpfully, and 𝗧𝗖𝗍 scoffed into the blackness. "And how'd you reckon we're gonna get to the top of it again?" Izuku frowned. "Honestly, I didn't think that far." 𝗧𝗖𝗍 scoffed again. Izuku peered around. It was almost completely black, but there was a weird, greenish light emanating from the scary lady on their Roman shield, just enough for Izuku to make out the benches that had become the ceiling of their little hallway and the flapping door of the hatch that they'd evidently fallen out of. 𝗧𝗖𝗍 tugged on his undershirt. "Hey, 𝗬𝗵𝗲, you're still bleeding." Izuku obediently bobbed over, and for a minute there was no sound beside the sloshing of water as 𝗧𝗖𝗍 rebound the strips of his tunic, and a faint rushing noise. "Kaken, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Actually, please do. I'd love to be wrong, but I think this air pocket might be getting smaller." When 𝗧𝗖𝗍 looked up, Izuku knew he was right. His blonde spikes, soaked through and still defying gravity, brushed against wood that had been inches away minutes before. "This really is our lucky day, isn't it?" Izuku thought morosely. "Fuck," 𝗧𝗖𝗍 drew out the word, and then louder, He moved the shield towards Izuku. "We're not in drowning today, after all that, so you hear me. Wait the here," and he made to dive underwater. "Wait," Izuku cried, snagging his arm, "what are you doing? It's too far up, you'll never make it." 𝗧𝗖𝗍 gave him a withering look. "In case you forgot, I'm a goddamn dragon. We process oxygen different to you meatbags." Izuku gaped. Even as he gestured weakly to 𝗧𝗖𝗍's very human body. 𝗧𝗖𝗍 snapped back, "Yes, dickhead. Stay alive, I'm gonna look around. Maybe there's another air pocket or some SHT," and then he was gone. Izuku waited. And waited. Alone. Alone and in the dark, save for the sickly green glow of the shield reflecting off the lapping water. Distantly, Izuku realized that he was shaking, partially with leftover dregs of adrenaline but mostly because it was so horribly cold here, down in the deep, the kind that was so cold that it almost turned hot, prickling uncomfortably over his skin. Izuku waited 5 minutes. The ceiling brushed his hair. The rushing noise, which Izuku now knew was the sound of the air leaving their little pocket like a leaky balloon, hissed in his ears. 5 minutes more. Now, the air pocket had reduced so much that Izuku's head was squashed against the upside-down benches. He clung to the thread of the bond in his the only warm thing left in his body. "Kaken, where are you?" He didn't mean to send anything through, but Katsuki's reply echoed around his skull as clearly as if he were bobbing in the water behind him. "Found something. Get ready to swim." "What is it?" "I'm on my way back now, don't effing drown." 5 more minutes, and Izuku had to tip his head to keep his nostrils clear of the water. His heartbeat was slowing, the cold, probably, and he'd lost all feeling in his right arm. The glowing shield watched him impassively, tight in his numb hand. Movement, below him. Izuku was just about to panic when Katsuki's wet, disgruntled head popped back into the air socket. Izuku could have cried with relief. "Come on," barked Katsuki, wasting no time, "hang on to me, and kick like your life effin' depends on it, 'cause it does." Katsuki yanked the shield out of Izuku's grasp and positioned the 𝗧𝗲𝗧𝗟 strap between his teeth. Izuku took a huge breath, just before the sea swallowed up the last remains of their air pocket, and dived under the rim of the boat. The world was completely black. Salt stung his eyes. Katsuki gripped his arm in strong, sure fingers, and together they swam towards what slowly revealed itself to be a small hole in the side of an underwater cliff with a faint light shining out of it. Izuku's inner ears ached horribly, and the cold, crushing water tried its best to pop his lungs like a grape, but he clung to Katsuki and wrapped the bond around his waist as a sort of kaken-flavored rope as he wriggled into the hole. Izuku felt himself shoot up a short tunnel, and then he surfaced in a wide pool of water at the base of what looked like a gigantic underground cavern, gasping for air. The cavern was easily the size of the Great Hall and surprisingly light, considering they were so far underground. A colony of those glowing, electric nanodragons seemed to be the cause of it. They carpeted the great, arching ceiling and clung to the damp walls all around. For a moment, Izuku just floated on his back and stared at them, marveling at the fact that he was still alive. "Get out of the water, dumbass. Your fingers are gonna freeze off." Katsuki was glaring down at him, dripping from the water's edge. Izuku dragged his gaze away from the shirt clinging to his body, and to the hand he had extended towards him. "Alright," said Izuku, shivering violently as Katsuki set the shield by a rock and planted himself next to it. "This is better, much better. We won't run out of air here, at least." He tried to laugh, but it got lost somewhere in his chattering teeth. Katsuki glared at him over one shoulder. "Don't look so happy, we might as well be worm food. We're sitting ducks in this place." He gestured to the walls around them. "Sooner or later, something bigger than me is gonna come eat us." Izuku squinted at the walls. Underneath the writhing light bulbs were vast, fossilized dragons caught in the stone, most Izuku had never seen before. They didn't look friendly. Then we find a way out before that happens," he said determinedly, and Katsuki swept his arm in a wide, sarcastic gesture that Izuku took to mean, "Be my guest." For half an hour he walked round and round in circles looking for any sort of exit while Katsuki scowled at him from his perch on the rock. "Stop trying," he called, after Izuku's 5th round, "you're wasting your energy." Izuku ignored him, praying to Thor as he scrutinized every jagged corner. But apparently there wasn't very good reception to Valhalla down here. "Okay," Izuku admitted, joining Katsuki on the rock sometime later, "it doesn't look good, but I'm sure there's some way out of here." Katsuki glared at him incredulously. "Doesn't look good," he got to his feet. "Doesn't look good. Deku, do you know what this is?" He jabbed a finger at one of the fossilized dragons. Izuku eyed its long, bony body, its concentric circles of horrifying teeth. "No. It's what we call a whispering death," he spat. "It shreds people apart to kill them, after it's finished impaling them with its projectile spines." He stalked over to the next fossil. "I don't effin' know the name of this one, but it screams so loud that it literally blows its prey's head off." "The next one. This one's real fun." Katsuki's sarcastic drawl was mean on his face. "It sprays scalding water to kill its victims. Fancy being boiled alive." He marched a little further and slapped his hand on the belly of a particularly huge dragon, the nano-dragon skittering away from his palm. I'll show you something that doesn't look good. This 𝗧𝗏𝗃 paused. Izuku watched his hand shuffle over the wall. Watched him examine the stone. Deku, he said suddenly, I think there's a door. A door. Izuku scrambled to his feet with a sudden surge of hope. Once they had scrabbled away at all the dust and earth, they found it was a door, stamped right into the gut of whatever great beast had died in the stone. Is it a way out? Gasped Izuku. Let's in see then. Katsuki stepped forward to shove it open, but Izuku stopped him with his good hand. He had just noticed the skull and crossbones painted on the door, and the large, scrawling Norse letters engraved below it in weirdly familiar handwriting and rendered with what looked like the tip of a sword. Warning, it read, do not open this door unless you are the true heir to Grimbeard the Ghastly. Otherwise death and destruction and other truly awful things will follow. He read it aloud for Katsuki. They stood in silence for a few long seconds, waiting for Izuku's voice to finish echoing around the cavern. Grimbeard the Ghastly, Katsuki said slowly, isn't he one of the heirs who buried treasure in your stories? Izuku nodded, eyes on the grinning skull. Yeah, which means we're on Berk. Somehow. It must have been that free current. Deku. The sword. Katsuki's voice was breathless, high-strung. The bond between them even more so. Izuku could feel second-hand excitement pulse through it like a heartbeat. He took a healthy step back. Kaken, no. Katsuki's grin was full of teeth. Kaken, yes. Seriously, no, Izuku said, over his rising panic. You never look for buried treasure that doesn't want you to find it. Who the F said that? Crowed Katsuki. What a dumbass rule. But Izuku shook his head furiously. You don't know these pirates. They're the most wicked, nasty, horrible Vikings that ever sailed the seven seas. Grimbeard didn't even have an heir. The story goes that after he buried his treasure he hopped into a boat and sailed off to distant shores thousands and thousands of years ago, never to be seen again. This is definitely booby-trapped, if it isn't some bad practical joke. What? You chicken or something? Yes. Izuku screeched. Today we have 1. Narrowly escaped being slaughtered by Roman soldiers. 2. Nearly been attacked by a cage of wild dragons. 3. Almost eviscerated by a pack of hungry sharkworms. 4. Barely avoided going up in flames on not one but 2 sinking ships. And 5. Only just dodged meeting our death in a watery grave at the bottom of the ocean by the skin of our teeth. The stars are not on our side today, Kaken. Katsuki his lips. Yeah, he admitted, my pride is feeling sufficiently slayed, don't you think? Izuku gawked at him. He spluttered. Katsuki smirked and stepped aside. Go on. You're more likely to have this 𝗧𝗏𝗃 somewhere in you veins than I do. For a moment, Izuku considered refusing him. But maybe, just maybe, Izuku was a little stoked about potentially finding the lost treasure of freaking Grimbeard the Ghastly, the hooligan legend, and Katsuki's eyes were glittering with the same light he'd had mid-battle on the Roman ship, glorious red, layers and layers of it, and yet maybe that was the deciding factor that made him lift his hand and slide the thick iron bolt to the side, but that was between him and Thor. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the heavy wooden door swung open. Izuku, Katsuki, and all the ghosts of the dead dragons in the cavern behind them stood there, mouths flopping open and shut like fish in their astonishment. The doorway led into another gigantic cavern, but unlike the one at their backs, it was far from empty. It was filled to the brim with treasure. Piles and piles of lustrous golden coins with Caesar stamped on one side and Neptune on the other. Mound and mounds of gleaming rubies, as large as All Might's powerful fist, raw-cut and 𝗵𝘃𝗏. Handfuls of lapis lazuli, fat and ripe as scallops, and so blue that they might have been little scoops of the ocean itself, carved away with the dagger of some powerful god. Emeralds green as a mermaid's eye. Stacks of gleaming cutlery with winking diamonds embedded in their handles. Ornate mirrors with moonstones and curls of molded silver virtually dripping from their elegant frames. Ostrich feathers dipped in gold, necklaces as plump as oysters, swords as sharp as a conger's tooth with octopus tentacles writhing round the hilt, diadems heaped madly on top of each other in dizzying columns, shields like luminous bronze teardrops with Thor's snarling face emerging from the 𝗵𝗲𝗧𝗏. It was the sort of treasure someone could get lost in and forget themselves and their mind and this world at all. There was a cup at Izuku's feet. A glorious, polished goblet, perfectly round at the lip, with dolphins playing around the rim, so beautifully carved that it looked as if they were alive and leaping in a miniature golden sea. "Kaken," he said breathlessly, picking it up to show him, and then Izuku caught sight of something way back in the cavern, something that made his heart stop beating for half a breath and then begin in double time. Mounted on the far wall, all the way near the roof, just cresting the peaks of coins and helmets and bolts of shimmering fabric, was a sword. A truly magnificent sword, unsheathed from its richly decorated scabbard like it was showing itself off to the riches below. A bright, cruel thing with a furious portrait of Thor the Thunderer with a tangled seaweedy beard on its handle, and a zigzag lightning pattern across the blade. Izuku dropped the goblet. "Kaken, look, you were right. It's the Stormblade, the actual real-life Stormblade there on the wall." Izuku gasped, whirling to face Katsuki. But for some reason, Katsuki didn't look too enthused. All that bright, savage eagerness had drained away. In fact, he looked almost wary. It was a strange expression indeed to see on his face. "Kaken, I don't like it in here," Katsuki said gruffly. "Smells off." Izuku flapped an impatient hand. "That's probably because it's been shut up so long. The air is stale. Come on, it's right there, let's go get it." Katsuki shook his head. "Don't? Not worth it. Something ain't right." But Izuku wasn't listening. He'd gotten a foothold on the nearest mound of treasure and was scrambling up it, rivers of coins falling behind him in tinkling waterfalls. "Deku!" Katsuki yelled, the edge of his tone tilting into urgency. "Seriously, get the F down." But there was something yearning in him, right under his navel, so intense that it overwhelmed his exhaustion, his hunger, the pain shooting down his arm with every knock and jolt, the frantic twang of the bond in his palm, and consumed him with a burning, sweating need to hold that magnificent blade in his hand. Katsuki's shouting behind him was muffled, his ears full of cotton ball. Maybe he'd sail straight back into Hooligan Harbor with it raised high above his head. Surely All Might would welcome him back with open arms if Izuku had the Stormblade at his side. Slipping and sliding, Izuku launched himself at a large golden chariot wheel and heaved himself onto the next mound. He heard profuse swearing from behind him where Katsuki was presumably trying to follow Izuku up the golden stacks, but the sight of that sword pushed him forward faster than Katsuki could catch up. After what might have been minutes, but to Izuku felt like several jewel-lit days, he found himself one pile away. Just one titchy little treasure pile, and the sword would be in reach. He made to stagger clumsily onto it, and the mound of treasure moved before his eyes. Despite himself, Izuku paused. And good thing he did. With a great, slow heave, the last mountain of coins and cups and shields and helmets reared up and shook itself, contents cascading down in glittering waterfalls, breaking into Izuku's line of sight and rupturing the feverish yearning with a snap. The feeling returned to his fingers. Run, some primal, savage instinct vibrated through his bones. Run, and never, ever set foot in this place again. But something pale and white and quivering, dotted with huge, mug-sized suction cups and easily as thick as Izuku's entire torso, had emerged from the pile. Before Izuku could flinch, it punched forwards and wound its way around his waist, crushing his injured arm to his side. It stunk of death, and carrion, and dark, rotting, mildewy things that had never seen the light but wanted to devour it anyway. Behind him, Katsuki was screaming his name. The remaining treasure fell away, and in its place, loomed a dragon that made a sharkworm look like a goldfish. Its wings were shriveled and useless at its back, as were its tiny legs beneath it, but a writhing mass of gooey, fleshy, translucent tentacles protruded from its horrible body like a perverted, patchwork kraken. It was the color of nothing, and Izuku could see straight through its translucent scales to all its ugly, pulsating organs, its sluggish heart, its tiny brain, the forms of the unfortunate dragons it had eaten at various stages in its digestive system. Frantic mind whirring, dizzy with dense smell, something niggled at him about the size of that brain in particular. It didn't seem big enough to keep sensory track of all its tentacle extremities. And sure enough, they seemed to be wandering about like they had minds of their own, leaving slimy trails on the surrounding treasure. "Is food," hissed the creature musingly to itself, and Izuku nearly passed out. Pure, perfect fear slammed into him, so much of it that Izuku felt the overflow flash down through the bond in red-hot rivulets. The dragon was speaking Dragonese. It wasn't possible. Katsuki had said that dragons couldn't speak in their other form. He'd swore it under their BLD vow. This thing must have crawled from the depths of Hades, or another world, or somewhere out of time, for its black dragon tongue to wrap around the words like that, to spit them out of its gaping mouth and into the world where they did not belong. Not food. Izuku shouted wildly as the tentacle ascended, "I'm poisonous. Very, very poisonous." "Poisonous?" asked the creature, in that low, rasping, slither-snap voice. "It speaks, and it's poisonous." Izuku struggled in the tentacle. His fingers sunk into the quivering flesh and came away sticky. "I'm poisonous." The creature waved the tip of its tail in front of Izuku, the only sharp thing on its body, a single poisonous spine of sickly green. Izuku had seen spines like that on smaller dragons in his forest. They'd use it to inject prey or predators in soft bits around their scales and pump in various concoctions of toxins. Usually, the poor animal on the receiving end would be dead in a minute flat. Izuku was about to be that poor animal. He struggled harder. Above Izuku's head, Katsuki suddenly careened through the air in dragon form, fire and talons at the ready, roaring bloody murder. The dragon's tentacle slackened in its distraction, just enough for Izuku to wiggle out up to his hips. Katsuki unleashed the full extent of his impressive, deadly arsenal of defense, but Izuku watched in horror as his fire did nothing and the slashes and creatures he made with his talons and teeth reformed almost immediately, like the creature's flesh was some gloopy, viscous pond. "Stop," the bead roared, 𝗬𝗓𝗵𝗃 With what looked like a great amount of mental effort, it refastened its tentacle around Izuku, lifted him into the air, and shook him menacingly at Katsuki. "Put your claws away, or I will strangle this one to death." Katsuki flapped backwards, snarling, and then shot forwards, jaw agape, and bit straight through the tentacle wrapped around Izuku. Izuku's fell into the treasure with a crash, and then bounced to his feet as the enraged creature bellowed and thrashed, knocking over mounds of gold and jewels with its wayward limbs as it did its best to batter Katsuki out of the air. "Kaken!" Izuku screamed as a few of those tentacles towards him. "It has poison. Be careful." Katsuki away into from the creature's blind spot, just in time to evade the vicious arc its green-tipped tail cleaved through the air. Izuku leapt back too, and serendipitously landed on a pyramid entirely made up of weaponry. While the creature was busy with Katsuki, Izuku attempted to pick up one of the many swords, each as big and appealing as the storm blade itself, but he found that lifting them nearly unbalanced him off the pile. So he turned to something smaller, tucked under the belly of a silver shield, a modest, serviceable object that he immediately felt a kinship with because it was a little rusty around the edges. Perhaps the pommel was a bit dented, but it fit snugly in his hand anyway. The monstrous dragon, after failing to coordinate its tentacles enough to both subdue Katsuki and recapture Izuku, had taken to flinging treasure in all directions, emitting a horrible, unearthly wail that made the coins beneath Izuku's feet tremble. Just as he looked up to yell at Katsuki to flee, he spotted a spear whizzing in his direction, flung from the grasp one of the sludgy tentacles, and was surprised to find his arm 𝗬𝗪𝗧𝗍 up, and his sword knocked the spear out of the air in a perfect pikeman's parry. He stared at his arm, mouth agape. Once again, a fat purple jewel partially encased in hewn rock went hurtling for his head, and again, Izuku's arm flashed up and parried it, just before it hit. Astonished, Izuku watched almost from the sidelines, guys from the sidelines, as his own blade began raining down blows thick and fast, swiping and slashing and lunging, knocking projectiles out of the air, biting at wayward tentacles, all with the very same perfectly executed moves that Izuku had taught to Katsuki in their secluded glade so long ago, but had been unable to do himself. He could sense Katsuki's eyes on him, could feel the bond in his warm with amazement and something that might have been pride, even as 𝗧𝗖𝗄𝐁 rained hell down on the creature's other side. Well, F me, 𝗧𝗖𝗄𝐁 cackled at the back of Izuku's head. Turns out the little nerd is left-handed. Turned out he was. See, Izuku had picked up the sword with his left hand. His right was weeping BLD, ruby red, onto the treasure below. It felt like Izuku had spent his whole life walking upside down. The clumsiness of it, always falling over, always stumbling, always fighting an uphill battle when everybody else seemed to have it so easy. Finally holding a sword in his left hand was like discovering he could walk on his feet, after all. For a few minutes, it seemed to be looking up. Izuku's sword was a line of slick silver in the air. 𝗧𝗖𝗄𝐁 had managed to bite through several more tentacles, his maw plastered with reeking white blubber. Izuku was almost enjoying himself, actually, when the creature seemed to have had enough. With one focused heave, it brought several tentacles up towards the craggy, vaulting roof, and down towards 𝗧𝗖𝗄𝐁, too many for him to dodge, and smashed him to the treasure below with an ear-splitting rattle. Kaken! Izuku screamed, all cylinders firing, threw himself in 𝗧𝗖𝗄𝐁's direction, preparing to crash into another tottering column of gilded breastplates, when a tentacle sunk out from behind him and strangled around his body, trapping his sword at his side. Stop moving, the beast insisted furiously. I can't eat you if you're moving. Kaken, Izuku thought desperately, forgetting his own predicament in his panic. Kaken, are you okay? Please tell me you're okay. I'm fine, shitty nerd. 𝗧𝗖𝗄𝐁's black snot popped out from between two soggy tentacles to glare at him. Worry about yourself. You're staring death in the effing face. Get the F out of there. But the tentacle was oily band around his body, tightening with each of his pathetic, wiggling attempts to escape. Don't you dare die. 𝗧𝗖𝗄𝐁 sounded tight, frenzied, edging into pleading. I swear to your gods, Deku, if you die I'll follow you to the afterlife and kill your sorry but again. The creature began to unhinge its jaw. Izuku's mind went razor sharp. This long night had taught Izuku a lot of things about himself. One of these was that although he bumbled through regular life with all the grace and finesse of a drunk turkey, he was surprisingly good in a crisis. Are you planning to eat me then? Izuku asked as loud as he could, and the great dragon paused, Izuku dangling halfway to its cavernous mouth, and drew him back to examine him. Yes, the dragon said slowly, you is food. Food is for eating. I agree. Izuku called enthusiastically, trying not to cringe at how unnatural it felt for that horrible lipless mouth to speak, and eating is such an, enjoyable experience. Why must be really glad we wandered in here, 𝗧𝗂𝗃? The creature eyed him. Yes, it said doubtfully, I suppose I am. A plan of the release the wild dragons on the Romans and drown yourself to escape the sharkworm's variety, germinated in the part of his brain largely unhindered by logic or reasoning. Alright, Izuku tried his best to keep his voice light. Good for you. But, and I'm not judging you at all, but don't you underground types usually, kill your food before you eat it? The beast seemed to ponder that for a moment. That's right, it replied eventually, but you was being tricksy. I wanted to eat you as quickly as I could. You've caught me, Izuku said cheerfully, surreptitiously shuffling in the creature's slick grasp, and my friend's very squashed down there. Don't you think it's safe to kill me now? Deku! 𝗧𝗖𝗄𝐁 shrieked inside his skull, the bond alive and contorting over itself in distress, freezing Izuku's lungs flat with anxiety that wasn't his own. What the F are you doing? It's gonna eat you. It won't listen to your stupid games. Get down from there. You know, I think I just might, the beast exclaimed delightedly. I will strangle you to death, squeeze you, suffocate you, and its oozing tentacle began to wring Izuku out, scorching pain ricocheting down his arm. But that's so old-fashioned. Izuku yelped, what about the poison? That's the most modern method of killing around. It's much less hassle for you to just prick me than it is to strain your tentacle like that. The creature paused. Much better for me, much worse for you. How so? Izuku stalled, kicking his legs this way and that to try and rotate himself inside the creature's vice grip. Behind his eyes, Katsuki's enraged, near-manic voice echoed, calling him crazy, stupid, suicidal. "It's not a Nick's way to go." The beast hauled the tip of its tail between them so it glinted in the warm light of the treasure, needle-sharp and so vividly green it looked painted. "Very yucky." "I don't mind," Izuku said, squirming, shoving, finally managing to dislodge his arm from where it had been clamped at his side. "I just want you to enjoy your dinner." With his free hand, Izuku snatched a tasseled epaulet from off a nearby column and frisbeed it directly at the dragon's head. With his newly excellent coordination, it smacked straight into the center of one of its milky eyes. The creature howled in fury. "I told you, no tricksing," it sneered with venom in its voice. "This will kill you dead." The bond in Izuku's eyes flared bright with hopeless horror as the great, beastly dragon reared up and sunk its tail spine directly into the flesh beneath Izuku's shirt. The guard dragon had been flying for days. She was wet, exhausted, aching with hunger, and the muscles in her wings burned at her back. The higher she flew, the fiercer the winds became, and she had to fight against their attempts to pick her up and slam her into the ragged cliffside. Eventually she crested the lip off the cliffs and flapped gratefully into a familiar basin, the air still at last. A border watcher stopped her, evidently some inept new recruit, and she shook off her dragon form with a rippling crack. "It's me," she snapped, wiping off her tunic. "Call a council meeting. I have news." "Lady," the border watcher bobbed her head and curtsied far too shallowly. "Lovely to have you back. The council has already gathered to discuss another matter. If you're quick, you might catch the end of the meeting." MT Lady couldn't help but huff. Of course, some other blithering reptile, probably much uglier than she was, had stolen her thunder once again. At least she wouldn't have to wait half a week while the stupid members flew in from all around the archipelago. Cursing her sodden waistcoat, she flounced through the stone labyrinth carved beneath the basin. She heard the voices of the councilmen echoing off the walls before she'd even rounded the corner. Countless before them. "What makes you think? Right to be wary. The Dragon Whisperer's way has never been opened. 10 items. Who could possibly collect?" Seated atop a torch bracket and its dappled paw was an infernal dragon Lady unfortunately recognized. That BLD-obsessed Toga Himiko of the Vikings' stupid library had sent a letter then. She regarded the ragged thing disdainfully down the length of her nose. Only a matter of time before, every single one, dead. And they didn't even get past the sword. "Even our own finest warriors haven't come close." MT Lady picked her nails. "Silence," roared a strong, authoritative voice from the very center of the U-shaped bench. "We have a visitor." The lady stalked forward and curtsied. "Finally. Hi everyone. Mitsuki. Takayama. What's news?" Lady flicked an invisible piece of lint off her shoulder. "My tribe is mobilizing. Westward. There was word about the things." Immediately, uproar. "Silence." Mitsuki screeched again. She sighed and scrubbed at her temples. "2 pieces of evidence does not mean we lose our heads. Takayama, are you certain that's what you heard?" Lady rolled her eyes, deigning not to answer such an idiotic question. Mitsuki sighed again. "Fine. Open to the floor. What should we do?" "Wipe them out," hissed a stout, balding man at once, banging his red fist on the stone. "Wipe them out, like we should have done years ago." There were murmurs of assent. Mitsuki held up an elegant hand. "You know very well that we cannot do that. Some of the island tribes may be basically defenseless, but our troops are decimated at the Viking strongholds. No amount of firepower will get through the slave land walls or penetrate the murderous mountains. I will not try again and risk another loss of that scale." More murmuring. Lady watched with interest as Mitsuki's burning red eyes swiveled to a smug-looking man who had raised one of his long fingers, peering back at Mitsuki over the end of his hooked nose. "Riestro," she said, face tense, "do you have something to add?" "I do indeed, thank you," he drawled, leering saucily through 2 big teeth. MD Lady felt her skin crawl. "I propose we check the barrier at Devil's Gates and the whereabouts of the Roman shield, which are usually the things those infernal heroes scurry after first, also the only 2 we have any idea about," Mitsuki interjected dryly, "which is why I've already sent scouts to check." 𝗬𝗧𝗃 swept a lazy hand. Behold, Governor Mitsuki, ladies and gentlemen. Well then, once the scouts return, we shall have our answer. If the things have been left alone thus far, we will do nothing but continue to monitor the situation. Those teeth were back, glinting in his thin-lipped mouth. If we do find evidence of tampering, I propose we double the attacks, double the forest fire burning, double the Viking casualties, really make them sweat. The councilmen were whispering amongst themselves. 𝗬𝗧𝗃 continued, once we've dwindled their numbers, we start on their food supplies. Poisoning waters and such. We send members into their strongholds to destroy their food supply, starve them out of their pathetic fortresses, typical siege warfare. The lady thought to herself, and Mitsuki seemed to agree. No, she snapped, we are not animals. We have no reason to punish thousands for the actions of a few. The purpose of this war has and always been to curb the potential of our enemies, not to obliterate them as, say, pigs like the Romans would. Besides, the intentions of these jewel seekers, if that is what they are, remains unknown. Perhaps they are looking to do good. 𝗬𝗧𝗃 threw his head back and bellowed a laugh. It echoed meanly around the chamber, like two stones clattering in a metal bell. Good. There is no such thing as a good Viking, Mitsuki. Perhaps you are losing your touch. Even empty lady heard the threat. A muscle feathered in Mitsuki's jaw. Looking pleased, 𝗬𝗧𝗃 turned to the rest of the room. With the stragglers, he said, voice hard, we will wrap chains around their ankles, brand them as they have done to us, force them to labor for our benefit, we will give them a taste of all our winged brothers have endured while we stand idle. There was much shouting and stomping of feet. Mitsuki stood, the planes of her face grave. I do not agree, she said solemnly, but this council is an equal space. 𝗬𝗧𝗃 proposes an escalating attack on Viking forces if we find indication that they seek the dragon jewel. All in favor, light your bowls. One by one, councilmen around the chamber shifted into dragon form and blew a stream of flame into the bowls before them, igniting the kindling and casting their vote. MD Lady did a quick count. More than half. Mitsuki, bowl untouched, bowed to the room. It has been decided. Thank you for gathering with me today. She bowed once more and strode from the room. Feeling sick to her stomach, Lady followed her. She wanted to be as far away from that man, 𝗬𝗧𝗃, as she possibly could. Shigaraki's skin itched. Flakes of it lined his ragged fingernails. There was an ache in his teeth, too, throbbing like it always did when he went too long without rewarding himself. Something else for him to do later. Leave me. A tall, scaled man that had been seated beside him stood and bowed, leaving Shigaraki in a ring of flickering firelight. Their ship was shrouded in thick, gray fog, but the rain made it through anyway. Shigaraki clenched his fists against the urge to hiss and bat at it. When the man's footsteps had faded, Shigaraki knelt to dutifully fill the grooves in the deck with blood dribbling from a tear in his wrist that he had reponed with one vicious tug of skin. He sat back on his heels. And waited. I hope you have not summoned me to kiss my boots, Shigaraki. A lipless grin, and Shigaraki rose to his feet. Sir. It is good to see you. Are you well? I'm fine. Wrong. You are restless. Shigaraki irritably dropped his hands from where they had been relentlessly scratching at his forearms. I'm not. My wards need reapplying. I was not under the impression that you called me here to whine. No, then what is it? Before your BLD dries beneath out feet. Shigaraki felt a gust of salty air scoop his fringe out from in front of his face. Eyes in the council claim there are new seekers of the things. They are the first who have stolen the book. Silence. The sloshing of the ocean. The gentle hollowness of rainfall. Then, laughter. You worry about beetles who think themselves heroes. A large, white hand gripped Shigaraki's chin. You, who has my power lurking beneath your skin. Do not forget how many have marched this path. And how many have been crushed, his fingers tightened, beneath your boot. He released his hand. Shigaraki desperately wanted to itch. Check the jewel. You will stand guard if you must. Otherwise, bother me with something more worthwhile than bugs next time we meet. Shigaraki bowed. And then he was alone on the deck. BLD dry. Katsuki loosed a gut-wrenching, heart-shattering roar. Izuku didn't look at him. The beast didn't have teeth, but it seemed to be grinning in triumph. So, Izuku said carefully, trying not to jostle, while we're waiting, do you mind, telling me how this poison works? Well, said the beast, you will lose control of your limbs as they start to stiffen. Below them, the monster's tentacles were leaping about violently in rigid, blubber-y rods. That's really interesting, Izuku chatted. I would have guessed something as fast-acting would cause paralysis first. What's next? The poison turns some victims green before they die, hissed the dragon. Well, Kaken says I'm already mostly green, so I don't think that's going to be a problem, Izuku told it cheerfully. His skin remained as pale and freckled as ever. There was, however, a strange green cloud building in the beast's translucent body, creeping up from its tentacles and gradually obscuring all the unfortunate dragons it was digesting. And as the poison reaches the brain, it continued, the nervous system simply stops. It looked at Izuku hopefully. That's funny, it's awful, drooping face seemed to be trying to frown, it doesn't seem to be working, maybe it takes longer for some people, reassured Izuku, say, you're looking a little peaky yourself. Maybe you should lie down. The beast looked down. The green cloud had now blown into every nook and cranny of its body, and was finally billowing up its sunken neck. What have you done? It raged. What have you done to me? The green reached its tiny brain, and the beast's nervous system simply stopped. It was all a bit anticlimactic, actually. The great, sopping mound of dragon fell completely slack, blank eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. It listed to one side, then the other, and finally, after what seemed like eons of swaying this way and that like some wretched, infernal pendulum, it crashed into the sea of treasure with a deafening cacophony, taking Izuku along with it amongst the sound of 1,000 plates breaking against the stone, one final chorus of relief from the gold it had so covetously guarded. The silence that followed was astounding. Then, Izuku. Katsuki had returned to his human form, and evidently fished himself out of his tentacle cage. Izuku? Here. Izuku called, muffled, partially buried under blubber and bounty. The clattering of metal. Then Katsuki's smudged, filthy, fuming face in his line of sight. What the actual flying F did I just in witness? Katsuki shouted, red-faced, unwinding the coils locked around him with furious hands. How the F I saw it skewer you. Grinning, Izuku lifted his shirt in answer. There, wrapped around his Isian stomach, was the fatty tip of the tentacle he had been dangling by, and right in the center of the gelatinous flesh was a giant puncture mark with the green poison still clearly coursing under the scales. I pulled my shirt over the end of it when I threw that thing at its head, Izuku said happily, because it couldn't really control its tentacles very well. I figured it had limited sensory contact with them too. Especially the ends. He wriggled out of the last of his slimy restraints. It looked more angry than in pain when you bit them off, which was another clue. Oh, right, thank you for staying. Fighting it even when you didn't have to. I know you could have left, don't even try to deny it. Anyway, it didn't realize that it had actually injected itself with that spine, which is why I had to convince it to use it. If it had decided strangled me to death, I never would have made it out. I'm so sorry for worrying you, Kaken. I didn't want it to suspect Eep. Katsuki's hands had sandwiched his face, one on either side, flexing and releasing on his cheeks. Izuku's arm was halfway to wrapping itself around his head, but the expression Katsuki was wearing was soft, almost pained. I can't believe that worked, he croaked, gently shaking Izuku by the head. I can't believe it. Something glinted at the base of his neck, right where his hair stopped, but before Izuku could squint at it, Katsuki yanked him forward by his cheeks and smushed Izuku's face into his shoulder. At first, Izuku didn't really get what was going on. Then Katsuki's arms came up to band around his back, and the reward center in Izuku's brain went oh. They were hugging. They were hugging. For the second time ever. Technically the first, because Katsuki hadn't quite reciprocated Izuku's goodbye squeeze all those many months ago. For a moment, Izuku was as stiff as a board. Then he felt every aching muscle in his body melt into Katsuki's steadiness, like an ice cube on a steaming pan. He stuffed his nose into the sticky smooth skin of 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻's neck, and the fingers of his good hand twisted into the damp fabric of the shirt at 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻's waist. He was so warm. The bond was thick and dilated between them. Izuku felt almost as if he could reach a hand in and grab 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻's entire being on the other side. His heartbeat matched Izuku's own, beat by rapid beat, scared me so bad, was the though right at the forefront, and Izuku flushed down to his toes, certain 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 hadn't meant for him to hear that. "You're a goddamn maniac, you know," were the words 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 said aloud, voice strained. "A lucky goddamn maniac." Izuku grinned wider and bounced on his toes on the shifting coins, still giddy with his unlikely success. It was lucky, he admitted, burrowing himself further into 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻's solid tea. But it turned out okay, didn't it? Izuku felt 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻's scoff right under his ear. "Yeah. He pulled back to examine him, the light in his eyes dancing. "I'm still at you. We're gonna have a talk later about your shitty self-preservation instincts." His arms tightened once, then eased away, and Izuku took that to mean his threshold of affection had reached its limit. Reluctantly, Izuku drew himself out of 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻's bubble of warmth. He didn't let 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 go far, though, locking his good hand around his elbow. "And where the F did those sword moves come from? You were grim at sword fighting like half an hour ago." Swapped hands, Izuku mumbled, beaming, and 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 ruffled his hair, apparently uncaring that half of it was matted with goo. "I saw that. Sneaky F." Speaking of swords, 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 said, a chin at the Stormblade still miraculously mounted on the wall, even after all their racket. "I reckon it's time you got what you came here for." Izuku eyed the sword. He remembered that strange, feverish pull that had dragged him across the cavern and into the arms of the beast. Even the echoes of it made the hair on his arms stand straight up. What do you feel when you look at it, Kaken?" "What, the sword?" Izuku nodded. 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 shifted a little, sending coins tinkling. "I feel like it's a badass F-in weapon. Nothing else." 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 frowned at him strangely. "What are you trying to say?" "I think you should have it," Izuku said firmly. "It's not good for me." "It has?" He didn't want to say magic. Izuku wasn't really sure what magic was, actually, other than the vague understanding that it could curse and bind sometimes, and tended to have super-duper horrible consequences if misused. The healed scar on his palm throbbed. "'S fine. Not like I'd complain. 'Sides, you got your pick of anyone in this 𝗵𝗵𝗃 cave." Izuku glanced around. There truly was enough magnificent weaponry in here to fill a Roman armory several times over, and then supplement the coffers of Caesar himself with whatever remained. Izuku contemplated the bristling arsenal, and then clambered carefully over runways of goo to retrieve the tarnished little sword still lost in the folds of tentacles. He turned it over in his hand and wiped the blade on his. "I think I like this one." 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 narrowed his eyes at the sword, then at Izuku, expression one of resigned disbelief. "Drowns a Roman legion, escapes a pack of sharkworms, slays a dragon. Of course you'd pick the ugly F-in toothpick. Why didn't I think of that? Come on, dipshit, let's get that thing and get the F out of here." He tugged the beads in Izuku's hair briefly and stuffed the crabby little sword into an appropriately sized scabbard, and then into a loop on Izuku's. The matter apparently settled. Izuku couldn't help but feel a little bit guilty climbing the coils of the dead dragon to reach the bracket, even as he plugged his nose against the revolting stench. 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 shot him an incredulous look over his shoulder. "It tried to poison you, Deku," he said loudly, "and only after it tried to strangle you. Or did you forget?" Izuku hastily withdrew from the bond and mumbled something about integrity after death. 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 glared at him. "All right, it tried to hurt me. What's your stupid bleeding heart got to say about that?" Suddenly, Izuku didn't feel so very bad anymore. Although looking at the Stormblade was no longer accompanied by any insistent pulling sensations, Izuku still made sure 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 was the one who took it off the wall. It was looked as good in his hand as Izuku had imagined. A large part of him wanted to stuff his head into a pillow and squeal or ask 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 for his autograph or something. He stamped down on the impulse before 𝗧𝗍𝗄𝐻 could get a whiff of it. He'd be insufferable. Despite its age, the Stormblade looked as if it had been smelted yesterday, gleaming and winking and bouncing around light like a mirror. Izuku's hands hovered around the blade reverently. "It's incredible, truly incredible," he muttered to himself, admiring the craftsmanship. "It really does look as if it could cleave 4 winds with a single swipe. Oh my goodness, humongously hotshot had his hand here, and so did big boobied Bertha of the bog burglars, and Alvin the treacherous before her, and 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗏 the strong silver-haired, and then her nephew snot-faced Snotlout. I can't believe it's real. All Might would be over the moon." Izuku stopped himself when he noticed Katsuki's wry, teasing grin. Izuku flushed and shrunk down into his collar. "You're impressed too," he mumbled, "don't deny it." Katsuki flicked a coin at his head. "Nerd. Shut up. Come on, you can obsess over it later. I need to get this off me." Izuku winced. He, too, could feel dragon residue drying tacky on his skin, and he followed Katsuki skating the piles towards the door. Katsuki snagged a couple of diamonds to shove in his pocket on their way down. Izuku picked the goblet up off the floor. He gave the treasure one last look, in all its gleaming, glittering splendor. Maybe one day he'd come back for it, gift a little of Grimbeard's bounty to each of the tribes in the archipelago, and some for wherever Katsuki came from, too. But Izuku had a feeling the world wasn't ready for these sorts of riches yet. Together, he and Katsuki bolted the door once more. They spent a good 15 minutes sloughing off the now dried, flaky dragon mucus, dunking their heads over and over to try and work it out of their hair. Katsuki gargled the taste of bitten-off tentacles out of his throat. Izuku cleaned around his wounds as best as he could, and Katsuki rebound them for what must have been the 3rd time in as many hours. Eventually, there was nothing more to clean, and they were faced with the fact that they still had no way out of here. The dragon must have some route to the surface, Izuku mused as they huddled together in the shallows, wringing out their sleeves. "Did you see all the dragons in its stomach? Maybe there's some sort of natural catacomb system. If we find it, we could make our way up to 𝗵𝗃𝗃. Katsuki shook his head. "Not a effin' chance. You haven't seen the SHT that lives underground in places like that. 10 times eviler and uglier and more dangerous than that tentacle F. And they sure as hell won't listen to anything you've got to say." "Oh, that reminds me, I thought you said. I mean, how did that dragon?" There was something stopping him from asking outright, "How did that dragon talk?" The thought of putting the question out into the air turned his stomach, like even the idea itself was imbued with that same, otherworldly wrongness. "Yeah. I told you already. This," Katsuki spread his long fingers before him, "is from that curse, remember? Before it, dragon didn't need shitty human mouths to say whatever the F they wanted." "That dragon? Yeah. Oh my gods. Aha. Exactly how old was that thing?" Katsuki's face was dark. I dunno, thousands of years at least." Izuku shuddered. "Why? We'll find another way." They brainstormed for hours. Every idea either of them came with was picked apart immediately. Izuku could feel Katsuki's frustration building at the other end of the bond, even as his face remained carefully schooled. They scoured the walls of the cavern again, hoping to happen upon another secret entrance, but found nothing but bones and dust. Eventually, Izuku lay back on the stones and closed his eyes, half hoping for a solution to just hit him. His stomach growled in complaint. The meal they'd shared on the hopeful puffin seemed very far away. Eventually, Katsuki was shaking him awake. Izuku must have fallen asleep, right there on the hard floor. He rubbed the grit out of his eyes. "Kaken, I've got an idea," Katsuki said. He didn't look very happy about it. "That's great," Izuku said, reaching through the bond, but Katsuki had retreated almost entirely inside himself. "You said you gotta go slowly if we use the water route," Katsuki began carefully, eyes intent on Izuku's face. Izuku fidgeted with the gravel at his feet, still not completely used to the full force of Katsuki's undivided attention even after all their time together. "Yeah," he replied to the non-question, "otherwise, my eardrums would burst. But Kaken, if we go slow I just drown. I can't hold my breath for that long." "What if you don't need to?" Katsuki pressed his lips together and looked away. "What if you don't need to? What if I could do it for you?" "What, hold my breath?" Katsuki nodded curtly. Izuku blinked at him. "I don't understand. I don't think the bond works like that." Katsuki groaned and stuffed his hands in his hair. For a nerd, you really are stupid sometimes, you know that. You're gonna make me say it. Now Izuku was really confused. But, you were the one who said you had an idea. I know. Katsuki yelled, F off. Do you have an idea or not? I do. Then what is it? Shut up. Kaken. Deku. Seriously, what is going on with you? Katsuki stalked forward, forcing Izuku to stumble over his feet in retreat. One finger jabbed insistently at Izuku's 𝗧𝗑𝗧 with every word. Izuku frowned and rubbed his breastbone. There's nothing to make weird yet, because you haven't told me anything. Katsuki scrubbed a hand over his face, mouthed something at the ceiling, and then pinned Izuku in place with those red eyes. I could exhale oxygen. Free into your mouth. Ration it between us, so your stupid, useless, weak body can make it to the surface. Izuku's mouth popped open. Katsuki's eyes dropped to it, and Izuku covered it self-consciously with a hand. His heart was beating funny, like it had migrated to his stomach. Izuku opened his mouth again, closed it, feeling odd and off-kilter. Was it getting warmer in here? Izuku definitely thought it was getting warmer. Maybe they were on a steam vent. Stop. Stop, I can feel you freaking out. I told you not to make it weird. Who's making it weird? I'm not making it weird. Izuku squeaked, voice cracking. I knew you'd lose your head over this. Forget it. We'll figure out another way. Izuku steeled himself and tottered onto his tiptoes so he and Katsuki were Kaken. We're out of time. He was right, he knew he was right, but Katsuki's eyes were careful on him anyway. Assessing. Unbidden, Izuku remembered the pour of relief he'd felt at the sight of Katsuki's scowling face between the bars of his prison cell. Was that only a couple of nights ago? It seemed a lifetime away. Something musical, symphonic almost, swelled warm in his teeth. Katsuki was so strong, so powerful, so cool, and here he was, following Izuku's stupid, crazy plans without so much as batting an eye, washing his hair with his particular brand of aggressive affection, flying headfirst into the tentacles of a practically mythical beast even though he reasonably could have fled the scene, offering him a place to stay when his own tribe had cast him out, and now, bargaining the own breath from his lungs to get Izuku to safety instead of turning tail and leaving without him, which Izuku knew he very well could. Gods, Izuku was so blessed. He wanted to grip Katsuki's hand, maybe pull him in for another hug. He swallowed at the memory of Katsuki's skin under his nose. Maybe Katsuki would let him. An embarrassed huff jolted Izuku out of his Katsuki-induced reverie, only to find the real thing glaring at the space above Izuku's head and red at his ears and the tops of his cheekbones. You're so embarrassing. Katsuki whisper shouted at him, and Izuku burned hot with mortification and flinched out of the bond. Sorry. Whatever. You want to do this thing or not? Izuku gave him a wobbly smile. It's just like resuscitation, isn't it? I've done that loads of times. Besides, it's fine, right? A muscle in Katsuki's jaw twitched. So embarrassing, he repeated, without venom, and shoved Izuku towards the gravelly bank of the pool. He fussed with Izuku's sling, and tightened the 𝗬𝗧𝗟 strap of the shield around his own forearm, the red and gold of its frame dark and purpling in the Nanadragon's wriggling light. Go. I'll follow you out. Izuku went. Cold. A stream of bubbles. The yowling rush of water beyond the pool. The world was muffled. The pressure down here was enormous, a deep ache in Izuku's ears and neck, and the water was dim and freezing and salty, so much so that Izuku could hardly see anything through the stinging of his eyes. But then there was Katsuki, emerging from the tunnel like an underwater angel, blonde hair floating around his head. He drew Izuku's arm around his torso and pushed off the rocks, muscling them upwards with one shoulder and kicking in time with the beats of Izuku's legs. The metal weighed them down, the swords at their side, the palm of the shield cupped around them, 3 points of pressure that tied them with invisible ropes to the mangled, sunken reef. Izuku pointed his toes and kicked as hard as he could. Together, they crawled through the water, inch after painstaking inch. Izuku's lungs seared. His fingertips were numb. He was beginning to feel lightheaded, but he could still see the murky shadow of the rocks beneath them when he slivered his eyes open. With an incredible effort, he managed to tighten his hold on Katsuki's back and squeeze once, twice. Between them, the bond quivered. Something brushed Izuku's face. Oh, those were Katsuki's fingers, pinching his nose shut, warmth bleeding through his skin, calluses softened by the salt. Katsuki was close, so close that when Izuku managed to blink through the haze, he could no longer see the water. Or maybe the water had fallen away entirely, replaced by steely red eyes and a CRP of dancing blonde hair. Katsuki sealed his mouth over his, and Izuku nearly breathed in a lungful of water. If Katsuki's hands were warm, then his mouth was scorching hot. Blistering, almost, against the frigid numbness that had stolen over Izuku's face. His other hand was hard under Izuku's jaw as he pried Izuku's lips open with his own, and Izuku felt the press of salty water at the corners of their mouths. And then Katsuki exhaled, right down into Izuku's starving lungs, and he had just enough wherewithal to remember to breathe in the air that tasted faintly like fire, and the smell of Katsuki's warm skin, and the sharp bitter tang of the minerals in the lake he'd washed his mouth out with. Oxygen rushed through Izuku's veins, all the way to the tips of his fingers. Gods, it was like a hit. Izuku tried not to whimper, tried not to sigh the air right back into Katsuki's mouth, tried to keep clumsily kicking his legs, but he couldn't focus on anything besides the soft yield of Katsuki's mouth, the heat turning him to ash from the inside out, the clumsy, wonderful bump of Katsuki's nose jostling his own. Again and again and again, they came together, Katsuki apparently sensing when Izuku needed a breath before he even knew himself. Izuku could feel his heart beating under the thin skin of his lips, swelled so big under his ribs, and Izuku's head was stuffed with cotton, and each brush of their skin made him shiver, and it was too much, and not enough, and everything was boiling, and Izuku had never felt the enormity of anything like this, not even once in his short, ill-advised life. The surface met them with the dawn. Sterging clouds washed pink. Swaths of creamy yellow. It was drizzling, slightly, a gentle sheet of rain. Izuku's hand on Katsuki's shoulder. Red, glittering under lowered brows. Sodden green hair brushed back from a freckled forehead. The peak of the sun over silken waves. The bond between them, young, new, ancient, pleased. Then Katsuki cleared his throat. "Hold on to me," he murmured, drifting back, and Izuku clung to the broad plane of his back as if shifted and muscled open into a spread of familiar black wings. They were in the air, the droplets of sea wind blown off their skin, and Izuku's felt himself drifting despite his buzzing nerves, and Katsuki's smooth scales were so warm beneath one of his cheeks, and the rain was equally warm on the other, and right there, between the sunlit clouds, he slipped into a deep, contented sleep, the bond star-studded behind his eyelids.